There is a kind of gentle silence that only exists in the delicate hours just before the world changes forever. If you close your eyes and cast your mind back across the vast, dark expanse of the Pacific Ocean, you can almost feel the warm velvet of that December night. It is the deep, quiet darkness of a Saturday gently folding itself into a Sunday. The air is soft, carrying the sweet, heavy scent of wild orchids, damp earth, and the faint, rhythmic salt of the sea. The Hawaiian Islands rest like emeralds wrapped in midnight, floating in a sea of absolute, undisturbed tranquility. The waters of the harbor are glass. The moon is a thin crescent, casting just enough silver light to paint the ripples as they wash, ever so quietly, against the shore. Here, in this isolated paradise, the troubles of a fractured world feel impossibly far away. The fierce storms of Europe, the bitter cold of foreign winters, the anxious headlines printed in bold black ink, they are thousands of miles across the water. Here, there is only the gentle trade wind whispering through the fronds of the palm trees, a continuous, soothing hush that lulls the island to sleep. Resting in the cradle of the harbor are the great ships. In the daylight, they are monuments of steel and strength, but tonight, under the blanket of the stars, they are something else entirely. They are floating homes. They are quiet sanctuaries rising from the black water. The thick mooring lines groan softly, a slow, rhythmic creaking that sounds like the deep breathing of giants in slumber. The water laps against their massive iron hulls with a delicate, rhythmic tapping, a watery metronome keeping time with the peaceful night. Deep inside these great vessels, below the sprawling decks and the quiet guns, thousands of young men are fast asleep in their canvas bunks. They are stacked in tiers, breathing in the close, warm air of the ship, shoulder to shoulder with boys who have become their brothers. They are farm boys from the vast, golden plains of Kansas. They are city kids from the crowded, noisy streets of New York. They are quiet sons from the snowy pines of Maine and the dusty roads of Texas. Tonight, they are simply dreamers. Their chests rise and fall in a shared, silent rhythm. In their sleep, their faces soften. The tough exteriors they wear in the daylight melt away, revealing the innocent, hopeful youth beneath. They dream of home. They dream of baseball games played in the fading summer light, of warm apple pie resting on a windowsill, of the gentle voices of their mothers calling them in for supper. Not everyone is asleep. In a small, dimly lit corner of a quiet mess hall, a single lamp casts a warm, golden circle on a metal table. A young sailor sits alone, bathed in this solitary glow. His uniform is neatly pressed, though his collar is undone in the humid night air. He leans over a piece of delicate stationery, a fountain pen clutched carefully in his hand. He is writing a letter home. It is December, and his thoughts are drifting across the ocean to a living room where a Christmas tree might soon be decorated. He dips his pen, the soft scratching of the metal nib against the paper echoing faintly in the empty room. He writes about the impossible blue of the Hawaiian water, a color he had never seen before he joined the Navy. He writes about the sweetness of the fresh pineapple, the way the sun feels on his shoulders during the morning watch, and the strange, beautiful birds that sing in the trees. He pauses, looking up into the shadows, searching for the right words to tell his parents not to worry about him. He tells them that he is safe. He tells them that the Navy is taking good care of him, that the food is good, and that the sea is calm. He writes the words, "I miss you," and stares at them for a long time. With a slow, tender exhale, he folds the paper, carefully tucking his heart into a small paper envelope. He seals it, trusting that this little piece of his soul will safely cross the vast ocean to the hands of those who love him. Beyond the harbor, the civilian neighborhoods of Honolulu are wrapped in the same peaceful embrace of the night. Small, wooden houses with wide porches sit quietly along streets lined with hibiscus and banyan trees. The windows are propped open to invite the cool night breeze. Inside one of these homes, a mother walks softly down a narrow hallway. The wooden floorboards creak ever so slightly beneath her bare feet. She pauses at the door of her children's bedroom. The room is bathed in the soft, blue light of the night. She steps inside, her movements slow and deliberate, careful not to disturb the fragile silence. Two small children are tangled in their thin cotton sheets, their breathing deep and even. She reaches out, gently brushing a damp lock of hair from her son's forehead. His skin is warm. She pulls the sheet up to his shoulders, her hand lingering for just a moment to feel the steady, reassuring rise and fall of his chest. She smiles, a quiet, unseen expression of profound gratitude. In this beautiful place, far removed from the darkness gathering on the other side of the globe, she feels an overwhelming sense of safety. She believes, with all her heart, that tomorrow will be just like today. She steps out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar, and returns to her own bed, letting the distant, rhythmic sound of the surf carry her into dreams. Back on the ships, high above the sleeping decks, the night watch stands their quiet vigil. Young men in white uniforms pace the teakwood decks, their rubber-soled shoes making no sound. They lean against the cold metal railings and look out over the expanse of the Pacific. The ocean stretches out forever, an endless plain of dark, mysterious water meeting a sky overflowing with stars. There is no light pollution here, no city glare to wash out the heavens. The Milky Way sweeps across the sky like a river of diamond dust. A young lookout pulls his collar up against a sudden, cool draft of air. He breathes in deeply, filling his lungs with the clean, pure scent of the ocean. He feels small under the vastness of the universe, but he does not feel afraid. He feels a quiet pride. He is a guardian of this peace. He watches the slow, gentle movement of a solitary cloud passing across the face of the moon. He listens to the soft hum of the ship's generators humming deep below his feet, a sound like a giant, reassuring heartbeat. He thinks about the girl he left behind in a small town in Ohio. He remembers the warmth of her hand in his, the promise they made before he boarded the train for the coast. He looks at his watch. It is still the deep, quiet hours of the morning. Sunday is approaching, bringing the promise of a day of rest, of church services on the deck, of liberty passes and lazy afternoons spent on the warm sand of Waikiki. Everything is in its right place. The world is spinning gently on its axis. In the calmest hours of the night, the line between the sky and the sea blurs into a seamless canopy of dark blue. The sailors on watch speak to one another in hushed, reverent whispers, instinctively lowering their voices so as not to break the spell of the night. They share quiet stories of home, of brothers and sisters, of old cars they used to fix up in dusty garages, of the plans they have for when their service is done. They pass a thermos of hot coffee between them, the warmth of the metal cup a small comfort in the cool night air. The bitter, dark taste of the coffee grounds them in the present moment, a moment so perfectly still that it feels as though time itself has decided to pause and rest. As the hours slowly drift by, the deepest black of the night begins to yield, ever so slightly, to the approaching morning. It is not yet dawn, just the faintest, almost imperceptible softening of the darkness on the eastern horizon. The stars closest to the edge of the world begin to pale. The water in the harbor turns from a mirror of obsidian to a deep, bruised purple. The birds in the trees of the surrounding hillsides are still quiet, tucked away in their nests. The wind dies down to a mere whisper, as if the island is holding its breath in anticipation of the sun. The gentle, rolling hills of Oahu stand as dark silhouettes against the gradually lightening sky. There is a profound innocence to this approaching morning. It is an innocence built on a foundation of letters written home, of children sleeping safely in their beds, of young men looking up at the stars and believing that the world is a vast, beautiful, and peaceful place. The ships sway together, a silent brotherhood of steel and humanity, entirely unaware of the shadows moving far beyond the horizon. Listen to the water. Listen to the slow, steady breathing of a world at peace. It is Sunday morning. The air is cool. The sky is beginning to turn the color of pearl. And for just a few more precious, fragile moments, everything is perfectly, beautifully calm. Out in the endless, heavy black of the northern Pacific, the ocean keeps its deepest secrets hidden beneath the rolling waves. While the island of Oahu sleeps safely under a blanket of stars, wrapped in the warm scent of orchids and the gentle rhythm of the trade winds, the sea stretches out far beyond the horizon, growing colder and more mysterious with every passing mile. Out here, there is no scent of flowers. There is only the ancient, briny breath of the deep water, and a wind that carries the crisp, sharp chill of a winter that the tropical islands will never know. It is a vast, lonely expanse of water, a place where the world feels completely empty, and where the sky and the sea merge into a single, seamless curtain of velvet shadow. But the darkness is not entirely empty. Moving through the heavy swells, wrapped in a silence so profound it feels almost sacred, are the dark silhouettes of ships. They do not carry lights. They do not send signals into the night. They glide across the water like quiet phantoms, parting the Black Sea with a soft, continuous whisper of rushing water. The white foam rolls off their steel bows, glowing faintly for just a second in the starlight before dissolving back into the endless dark. On the decks of these moving shadows, young men stand their own night watch. They are bundled tightly in heavy wool coats, their collars pulled high to shield their faces from the biting wind. The sea spray settles on their eyelashes like tiny diamonds. Just like the boys sleeping softly in the harbor of Honolulu, these young men are far from home. They are sons and brothers, standing in the cold, staring out into an ocean that seems to have no end. One young sailor shifts his weight against the cold metal railing. His hands are deep in his pockets, his fingers gently tracing the shape of a small, silken amulet his mother pressed into his palm before he left his village. He remembers the day clearly. It was a morning filled with falling snow, the flakes catching in his mother's dark hair as she smiled bravely and told him to return safely. Now, surrounded by thousands of miles of moving water, that snowy village feels like a dream from another lifetime. He holds the small charm tightly, drawing comfort from the invisible thread of love that stretches all the way across the Pacific, tethering his heart to a warm hearth on the other side of the world. Below the decks of these silent ships, bathed in the dim, soft glow of red emergency lights, hundreds of other young men are awake. They sit in cramped quarters, listening to the deep, rhythmic thrumming of the engines. It is a steady, low hum that vibrates through the floorboards and into their bones, a lullaby of machinery carrying them forward into the unknown. In a quiet corner, a young pilot sits on his narrow bunk. He holds a small, black and white photograph of a smiling girl standing beside a bicycle. She is his younger sister. He traces the edge of the paper with his thumb, his eyes soft in the dim light. He does not know what tomorrow will bring. He only knows the weight of duty, the immense scale of the ocean, and the deep, quiet ache of missing the people he loves. He carefully slips the photograph into the breast pocket of his shirt, placing it right over his heart, where it will stay warm against the chill of the morning sky. There is a profound, shared humanity in the quiet hours of the night. Across the vast distance of the sea, boys in different uniforms, speaking different languages, are united by the exact same feelings. They share the same quiet fears of the dark. They share the same longing for the comforts of home. They share the same vast, starry sky stretching out above their heads, a sky that does not recognize borders or divisions, but only covers the earth in a gentle, protective embrace. The ocean itself is a neutral observer. It does not take sides. It merely carries the weight of the steel upon its back, a gentle giant moving in its eternal, rhythmic dance. The waves rise and fall, breathing in and breathing out, indifferent to the plans of men. The sea is ancient and wise, holding the reflections of the stars just as it has for millions of years. It whispers against the sides of the approaching ships, a soothing, continuous hush that seems to ask for peace. Back on the edges of the Hawaiian Islands, an American destroyer slowly patrols the outer limits of the harbor. The water here is much calmer, protected by the coral reefs and the sheltering arms of the land. A young American lookout leans against the railing, a pair of heavy binoculars hanging from his neck. He rubs his tired eyes and looks out toward the northern horizon. He cannot see the ships moving toward him in the dark. He cannot hear the low hum of their engines or the whisper of the water against their bows. He sees only the peaceful, empty expanse of the Pacific. He hums a quiet tune to himself, a slow, melodic folk song his grandfather used to play on a wooden porch in Tennessee. The sound of his voice is soft, floating out over the water like a gentle offering to the night. If you were to float high above the earth in this delicate hour, looking down at the immense blue curve of the world, you would see a heartbreakingly beautiful symmetry. You would see two groups of young men, separated by an ever-shrinking distance of dark water, both looking up at the very same moon. You would see boys on both sides closing their eyes and visualizing the faces of their mothers. You would see quiet acts of resilience, simple moments of hoping for a future filled with sunlight and laughter. They are all just drops of water in the same vast ocean of humanity, caught in a current much larger than themselves. The strict radio silence ordered across the approaching fleet adds to the surreal, dreamlike quality of the night. There is no static, no crackle of voices floating through the airwaves. The invisible threads of communication have been completely severed, leaving only the sound of the wind and the water. It is as if the entire world has taken a deep, collective breath and is holding it, waiting in the stillness. As the hours slowly drift by, the distance between the sleeping island and the silent fleet continues to close. The motion is steady, inevitable, yet completely devoid of anger or malice in this frozen moment of time. It is simply the quiet mechanics of history moving through the dark. A Japanese sailor walks carefully down a narrow corridor, carrying a tray with small porcelain cups of hot green tea for the men on duty. The delicate clinking of the cups is a soft, domestic sound that feels beautifully out of place on a warship. He hands a warm cup to a friend standing near a porthole. They do not speak. They only share a small, tired smile, finding deep comfort in the simple warmth of the tea and the silent companionship of a brother. They look out the small round window together, watching the black water rush by, mesmerized by the hypnotic, endless repetition of the waves. Time seems to stretch and warp in these final hours of darkness. Minutes feel like hours, and hours feel like fleeting seconds. The sky remains an ocean of ink, but the air is beginning to subtly change. The deep, heavy cold of the midnight watch is slowly starting to lift, giving way to the very first, invisible hints of the approaching dawn. The stars at the very edge of the eastern horizon are beginning to lose their brilliance, fading softly into the velvety background. The wind shifts, just slightly, carrying a newfound stillness. It is the hour of deepest sleep for the families nestled in their beds in Honolulu. The children are dreaming their sweetest dreams, their breathing slow and perfectly untroubled. The sailors in the harbor are wrapped securely in their blankets, safe in the warm belly of their floating homes. And out on the water, the quiet approaching shadows continue their silent glide, carrying young men who are also dreaming, hoping, and simply waiting for the sun to rise. Let us linger here, in this peaceful, fragile space between the night and the morning. Let us hold on to the gentle hum of the engines, the soft whispering of the waves, and the quiet beating of thousands of young hearts on both sides of the horizon. In this beautiful, fleeting darkness, the world is still whole. The water is calm. And the ocean breathes its slow, eternal sigh, cradling them all in the deep, soothing embrace of the night. High above the sleeping island, where the mountains gently touch the fading stars, two young men sat in the quiet dark, listening to the soft, rhythmic hum of a glowing green screen. At the very northern edge of Oahu, the land rises up from the sea to form a high, solitary bluff known as Opana Point. It is a lonely, beautiful place. Up here, the warm, fragrant breezes of the lower valleys are replaced by a crisp, cool wind that sweeps uninterrupted across thousands of miles of open ocean. The tall grass bows and dances in the dark, whispering secrets to the earth. The air smells of damp soil, crushed ferns, and the clean, sharp salt of the deep Pacific. In the quiet hours just before dawn, it feels as though you are standing on the very roof of the world, entirely alone, wrapped in the protective embrace of the sky. Nestled in this high, remote wilderness sat a small, olive-green truck. It was completely unremarkable from the outside, just a metal box resting on thick rubber tires, hidden among the shadows of the brush. But inside, it was a different world. It was a tiny, warm sanctuary humming with the soft electricity of a new, mysterious invention. Inside the truck, the air was thick with the scent of hot vacuum tubes, wool uniforms, and the faint, bitter aroma of day-old coffee lingering in a metal thermos. Inside this cramped, glowing space sat two young privates. They were just boys, really, far from their mainland homes, assigned to a remote outpost at the very edge of America's reach. They were tired, their eyes heavy with the familiar weight of the night shift. For hours, they had been staring into the small, round face of an oscilloscope, a delicate glass tube that painted a thin, pulsing line of green light across the dark. The machine was called radar, a quiet sentry that sent invisible fingers out into the dark sky, feeling for anything that might be moving above the clouds. But on a peaceful Sunday morning in paradise, there was rarely anything to feel. For the two young men, the night had been a slow, quiet river of routine. They passed the time as soldiers always do in the quiet hours. They spoke in hushed voices about the things that mattered to them. They talked about the girls they had left behind, wondering if they were thinking of them, too. They talked about their mother's cooking, trying to describe the exact taste of a warm cherry pie or the comfort of a Sunday roast. They leaned back in their creaky metal chairs, pulling their heavy coats a little tighter against the morning chill, finding deep comfort in the simple, shared boredom of the watch. The sun was just beginning to touch the very edge of the eastern horizon. The deepest black of the night sky was softly bruising into shades of deep violet and bruised purple. Down below, the island was still fast asleep, but up on the mountain, the two privates knew their shift was finally coming to an end. A supply truck would be making its way up the winding dirt road soon, bringing a fresh crew to relieve them. They were already thinking about breakfast. They could almost taste the hot pancakes and the fresh, sweet pineapple waiting for them down at the mess hall. They began to gently organize their small desk, preparing to shut down the humming machinery, ready to trade the isolation of the mountain for the warm, bustling life of the camp. And then, just as the boys were ready to pack up and go, the green line on the screen gently shifted. It was not a sudden, violent movement. It was a soft, blooming spike of light, rising up from the flat green baseline like a single blade of grass pushing through the soil. The private sitting closest to the screen leaned forward, his heavy eyes suddenly focusing on the glass. He blinked, thinking perhaps it was just a trick of the fading light, a momentary glitch in the fragile tubes of the machine. But the spike remained. In fact, as the invisible arm of the radar swept out over the ocean, the spike grew larger. It blossomed into a beautiful, towering peak of bright green phosphor. The young man called to his friend. He didn't shout, his voice was calm, colored only by a mild, innocent curiosity. He pointed a steady finger at the screen. They had been trained to read these ghostly shadows, to understand the secret language of the machine. A small spike meant a stray airplane, perhaps a lost pilot trying to find his way home. But this spike was enormous. It was the largest shadow either of them had ever seen, a massive bloom of light indicating a cloud of metal moving steadily closer through the morning sky. There was no fear in the small truck. There was no panic, no racing of hearts. How could there be? It was a beautiful Sunday morning in Hawaii. The world below them was perfectly at peace. The two friends leaned in close to the screen, their faces bathed in the soft, ethereal green glow. They gently turned the dials on the metal console, recalibrating the machine, quietly wondering if the equipment had simply malfunctioned. They checked the wires, they checked the connections, working with the slow, deliberate care of craftsmen. But the machine was working perfectly. The shadow was real. A gentle sense of duty settled over the small space. They were young, but they were diligent. They knew they had to report what they were seeing, even if it was just a mechanical error or a strange phantom of the clouds. One of the privates reached for the field telephone. It was a heavy, black piece of equipment, completely ordinary in his hands. He turned the crank, sending a small electrical pulse down the long, winding copper wire that snaked its way down the side of the mountain, through the sleepy valleys, all the way to a quiet information center at Fort Shafter. He held the receiver to his ear, listening to the soft hiss of the open line. Finally, a voice answered. It was another young man, likely just as tired, just as eager for breakfast. The private up on the mountain spoke softly into the mouthpiece. He explained, with a gentle, matter-of-fact calmness, that his screen was showing a massive flight of planes approaching from the north. He described the size of the green shadow, his voice steady, simply passing along a piece of a puzzle he did not know how to solve. The voice on the other end of the line was reassuring. It was a calm, older voice, a lieutenant who had looked at the flight schedules for the morning. He spoke softly into the receiver, telling the private up on the mountain not to worry. He explained that a flight of friendly American bombers was expected to arrive from the mainland that very morning. They were coming from California, tired crews looking for a place to land and rest. The massive shadow on the screen was nothing to be afraid of. It was just a flock of friends coming in from the dark. Don't worry about it, the voice gently told him. The young private lowered the heavy black receiver and gently placed it back on its cradle. A quiet wave of relief washed over the cramped truck. He turned to his friend and relayed the message. The mystery was solved. The world made sense again. The heavy spike on the glowing screen was no longer an unknown anomaly. It was simply a group of tired American boys, just like them, flying through the clouds, looking forward to a warm bed and a hot cup of coffee. The two privates smiled at each other in the dim light. They felt a small, quiet sense of pride. They had stayed awake, they had done their job, and they had kept watch over the island. They took one last look at the glowing green screen. The shadow was still there, moving closer, large and bright and entirely misunderstood. With a gentle click, they turned the main dial, and the humming of the machine slowly faded away. The green light collapsed into a single, bright, and then vanished completely, plunging the inside of the truck back into the quiet gray of the dawn. They gathered their things, picking up the empty thermos and fastening the brass buttons on their heavy coats. They pushed open the middle door of the truck and stepped out into the crisp, high-altitude air. The world outside had changed while they were looking at the screen. The night was gone. The sky was now a breathtaking canvas of soft peach, pale yellow, and deep, vibrant blue. The first pure rays of the sun were just cresting over the ocean, painting the rolling waves with ribbons of liquid gold. The tall grass on the bluff swayed gently in the morning breeze, catching the light like a sea of silver threads. It was, without a doubt, one of the most beautiful mornings they had ever seen. The two young men stretched their tired backs, taking deep, grateful breaths of the clean sea air. They stood side by side on the edge of the mountain, looking out over the vast, sparkling ocean. They were entirely innocent. They were suspended in a beautiful, fragile bubble of misunderstanding, perfectly safe in their belief that the shadows they had seen were friends. They didn't look up at the clouds. They didn't search the horizon for the approaching storm. They simply locked the door of their quiet little truck, turned their faces toward the sun, and began the slow, peaceful walk down the mountain, thinking only of Sunday morning, of rest, and of the peaceful day stretching out before them. There is a fragile, breathtaking beauty in the last deep breath the peaceful world takes before it wakes. If you were standing on the shores of the harbor on that Sunday morning, you would have felt the warmth of the sun just beginning to kiss the back of your neck. The world was slowly stretching, yawning out of its twilight slumber. The sky was a vast, uninterrupted dome of robin's egg blue, painted with only a few wispy, careless strokes of white clouds. The water of the Pacific was a mirror of perfect, tranquil glass, reflecting the golden light of the new day. It was the kind of morning that felt entirely woven from gold and soft breezes, the kind of morning where time itself seems to slow down, inviting you to simply be still and breathe in the sweet, floral air of the islands. Across the great, floating steel islands of the fleet, a gentle morning routine was unfolding. The decks had been washed clean, the teakwood gleaming wet in the sunlight. In the vast mess halls below, the comforting, domestic aromas of Sunday breakfast were curling through the passageways. There was the rich, dark scent of roasted coffee bubbling in massive metal percolators, the sweet, heavy smell of griddle cakes, and the warm, smoky hint of bacon. Young men, still rubbing the sleep from their eyes, shuffled in line with their metal trays. They were laughing softly, trading quiet jokes, their voices a low, easy murmur. Today was a day of rest. There were no heavy drills scheduled, no grueling exercises. For most of these boys, the day promised nothing more demanding than a church service on the sunlit deck, a letter written home, or perhaps a trip to the beach to feel the sand beneath their feet. Up above, on the weather decks, small groups of sailors in their crisp, blindingly white uniforms were preparing for the morning colors. It was nearly 8 o'clock. The brass bugles had been polished until they shone like mirrors, and the halyards were held loosely in waiting hands. They stood tall, feeling the gentle, rhythmic sway of the ships beneath them, a silent brotherhood bound by routine and the quiet pride of the morning. In the neighborhoods nestled against the lush, green hillsides of Honolulu, the island's families were also stirring. A mother stood at her kitchen window, humming a soft, nameless tune as she poured fresh milk into 2 small ceramic cups. Through the open window, she could hear the gentle rustle of the palm fronds, a sound like dry paper rubbing together in the wind. Her husband sat on the wooden porch, unfolding the Sunday newspaper, the crisp pages rustling loudly in the quiet air. In the yard, a little boy in a cotton shirt was pushing a small wooden airplane through the damp, dew-covered grass, providing his own soft engine noises. It was a scene of such profound, ordinary peace, a moment so deeply normal that it felt invincible. But out beyond the mountains, high above the clouds where the air is thin and cold, a different sound was beginning to form. At first, it was barely a whisper. It was a low, distant hum, so faint that it simply blended into the natural symphony of the island. It sounded like a sudden, heavy gathering of bees in a faraway valley, or the low, vibrating drone of a heavy truck shifting gears on a distant mountain road. The mother at the kitchen window paused, the milk pitcher hovering just above the cup. She tilted her head, listening. The father on the porch lowered his newspaper, furrowing his brow as the sound began to grow, gently vibrating against the wooden floorboards beneath his chair. On the decks of the quiet ships, the sailors waiting with their bugles turned their faces upward, squinting into the brilliant, blinding blue of the sky. There was no fear in these first few moments. There was only a mild, innocent curiosity. In the minds of the men and women looking up, the world was still perfectly safe. Their brains, accustomed to the comforting rhythms of peace, immediately built gentle explanations for the sound. It must be our own boys, they thought. It must be the army pilots out of Hickam Field, practicing their maneuvers early in the morning. Or perhaps it is the flight of bombers we were told to expect from the mainland, finally arriving after a long, lonely journey across the dark ocean. The low hum deepened, transforming into a heavy, resonant thrumming that you could feel in the center of your chest. The sound rolled down from the WWII mountains, spilling into the valleys like an invisible, heavy fog. And then, they appeared. They dropped out of the scattered clouds like a flock of dark, sweeping swallows. They were tiny, glinting specks of silver and green, moving with a terrifying, beautiful grace. They flew so low over the mountains that their shadows chased them rapidly across the deep green canopy of the sugarcane fields. Down in the yard, the little boy stopped pushing his wooden toy. He stood up, shielding his eyes with a small hand, and watched the planes fly over his house. They were so close he could hear the distinct, rhythmic pulse of their engines. He smiled and waved his hand high in the air, a gesture of pure, childlike greeting to the men in the sky. On the ships, a young sailor with a polishing rag in his hand leaned over the railing. He watched the first wave of planes bank sharply over the harbor. He admired their speed, the tight, disciplined formation they held as they descended toward the water. He turned to the boy standing next to him, a half-smile on his face, ready to make a remark about the crazy army pilots and their Sunday morning acrobatics. But as the planes drew closer, dipping down toward the still waters of Battleship Row, the morning light caught the wings of the lead aircraft. There, painted against the metal, were large, bright circles of crimson red. They looked like drops of blood against the sky. They were the emblem of the rising sun, a symbol from a world far away, entirely out of place in the gentle Hawaiian sky. For a long, surreal moment, time simply stopped. It is a strange and beautiful thing how the human heart tries to protect itself from the impossible. As the young men on the deck stared at the red circles, their minds simply refused to understand. A quiet, profound disbelief settled over the harbor like a heavy blanket. This cannot be real, they thought. It is a mistake. It is a drill, a very realistic, very foolish drill. They are testing us. They are trying to see how fast we can wake up. A young officer stood frozen, a cup of coffee halfway to his lips. He watched a dark object detach from the belly of one of the planes. He watched it fall through the air in a slow, graceful arc. It seemed to take an eternity to reach the water. He watched it with a detached, dreamlike fascination, his mind still quietly insisting that it was a dummy, a sack of flour, a theatrical prop meant to splash harmlessly into the bay. But there was no harmless splash. The first note of thunder did not sound like a machine. It sounded like the earth itself was clearing its throat, a deep, sorrowful tremor that began deep beneath the ocean floor and tore upward through the water. It was a heavy, blunt impact that violently shoved the massive steel ships, shaking them as easily as a child shakes a toy in a bathtub. The officer's coffee cup slipped from his fingers, falling in agonizing slow motion, shattering into a dozen white porcelain pieces against the metal deck. The dark coffee pooled around his polished shoes, indistinguishable from the shadows. The silence of the Sunday morning shattered into a million jagged pieces. The shockwave rolled across the water, an invisible wall of heavy air that pushed against the chests of the men, knocking the breath from their lungs. It swept over the harbor, rustling the palm trees on the shore, rattling the glass in the windows of the wooden houses on the hills. The father on the porch dropped his newspaper. The mother in the kitchen dropped her pitcher, her hands flying instantly to cover her mouth. The little boy in the yard stopped waving, his small face twisting in sudden, uncomprehending confusion as a cloud of dark, heavy smoke began to slowly rise above the tree line. On the decks of the ships, the crisp, white uniforms were suddenly bathed in a strange, unnatural light. The innocent assumptions dissolved in an instant, replaced by a cold, heavy realization that dropped into their stomachs like a stone. The drill was not a drill. The distant storm of Europe, the dark headlines they had read from thousands of miles away, had somehow crossed the vast, protective ocean and found them in their beds. Yet, even as the sky began to tear open, there was no immediate panic. There was only a profound, heartbreaking astonishment. Young men who, only moments before, had been thinking of their mothers, of baseball, of the letters in their pockets, simply stood and stared. They looked at each other, their eyes wide, communicating a silent, shared sorrow. The world they had known when they went to sleep the night before, a world of peace, of predictable tomorrows, of safe harbors, was gone. It had vanished in the space of a single heartbeat, carried away on the roar of an engine and the falling of a shadow. The gentle trade winds, which had carried the scent of orchids and salt just a breath ago, now carried a new, bitter scent. The smell of burning oil and hot metal began to drift across the water, a dark perfume signaling the end of an era. The bugles remained silent. The halyards swung emptily against the masts. The peaceful, golden morning had been fractured, giving way to a sudden, sorrowful rain, as the men of the harbor took their first, unsteady steps into a world forever changed. There is a profound, breathless weight to the moment a gentle dream is broken by the heavy hand of reality. Deep inside the massive, floating sanctuaries of Battleship Row, the Sunday morning was still wrapped in the soft, quiet innocence of sleep. In the long, narrow compartments below the waterline, hundreds of young men lay in their canvas bunks. The air was warm and still, carrying the familiar, comforting sense of wool blankets, polished brass, and the faint, sweet memory of the sea. They were boys drifting through the peaceful landscapes of their own minds. Some were walking down dusty country roads in the Midwest. Others were sitting on the front steps of city apartments, listening to the imaginary sounds of a distant radio. They were safe. They were surrounded by the quiet, rhythmic breathing of their friends, a soothing chorus of life in the belly of a gentle steel giant. And then, the world shuddered. It did not begin with a deafening noise, but with a deep, sorrowful vibration that seemed to travel through the very water of the harbor, passing through the thick iron hulls and straight into the bones of the sleeping men. It was a heavy, groaning tremor, as if the great ships themselves were waking from a long slumber in sudden, undeniable pain. Dust, undisturbed for months, drifted down from the overhead pipes like a sudden, gray snowfall in the dim light of the berthing compartments. The canvas bunks swayed. The young men opened their eyes. There was no immediate panic, only the slow, heavy confusion that comes when the waking world does not match the peace of the dream. They blinked into the shadows, the sleepy murmurs of their brothers rising in the quiet space. Someone whispered, asking if they had run aground. Another voice, thick with sleep, wondered if it was a strangely powerful earthquake beneath the Hawaiian Islands. They sat up, rubbing their faces, entirely unaware that the sky above them was tearing open. Then came the alarm bells. They began to ring through the narrow corridors, a sharp, metallic trill that cut through the lingering fog of the morning. Yet, even then, the minds of these young men, so deeply conditioned by the routines of peace, refused to accept the truth. They sighed. They reached for their dungarees, their movements slow and begrudging. They thought it was a drill, a frustrating, ill-timed exercise ordered by an officer who simply wanted to test their readiness on a day of rest. In the semi-darkness, small, incredibly human moments unfolded. A sailor from a small farm in Iowa knelt on the cold metal deck, carefully tying the laces of his boots by touch, his mind still lingering on the letter he had meant to finish writing that afternoon. Next to him, a young man from Brooklyn patted his pockets, blindly searching for his eyeglasses, his fingers brushing against a folded photograph of his sweetheart. His friend, seeing him struggle in the dim light, reached out, found the wire frames on a small shelf, and gently placed them in his hand. No words were exchanged, just a soft nod of gratitude in the shadows. It was a simple, instinctual act of care, a quiet promise that they were in this together. But as they began to move toward the ladders, the reality of the morning finally began to press down upon them. The great steel walls around them shuddered again, this time with a violent, terrible force that threw men against the bulkheads. The lights overhead flickered, buzzing like dying insects, and then, with a soft, collective click, they went out entirely. The darkness that filled the lower decks was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blackness that swallowed the familiar shapes of their floating home. And in that dark, the true nature of the storm above began to echo down the metal passageways. The muffled, heavy thuds of iron striking iron, the sorrowful tearing of steel, and the rushing, terrifying sound of water rushing into places it was never meant to be. Fear is a lonely emotion, but in the dark corridors of those ships, it was immediately met by something far stronger, brotherhood. When the lights failed, the young men did not scatter. They reached out. In the pitch black, hands found shoulders. Fingers gripped the rough cotton of the shirt in front of them. They formed long, invisible chains of humanity, guiding one another through the winding, tilted passageways. The air was growing thick with the bitter, burning scent of smoke, choking the lungs and stinging the eyes, but they moved together, a single, breathing organism of resilience. "I've got you," a voice whispered from the dark, a steady anchor in a world that was suddenly turning upside down. "Just hold on to me. We're going up." They moved slowly, feeling their way along the cold metal walls, their hands sliding over rivets and pipes they knew by heart. They were young, many of them just teenagers who had never seen the face of war, but in those endless minutes in the dark, they found a quiet, towering courage. It was not the loud, angry courage of the movies. It was a gentle, protective courage born entirely of love for the brother standing next to them. When one boy stumbled, two others were instantly there to pull him up. When the smoke grew too thick, they pressed wet cloths into each other's hands, sharing the very air in their lungs. As they climbed the ladders, pushing up toward the weather decks, the sound of the rain of iron grew louder. It was a devastating symphony of sorrow. Yet, to the men ascending from the dark, the only thing that mattered was the patch of light at the top of the hatch. When they finally spilled out onto the upper decks, stepping from the dark belly of the ship into the Hawaiian morning, the sight that met their eyes was beyond comprehension. The beautiful, perfect blue sky they had seen just an hour before was gone. It had been replaced by a bruised, angry canopy of thick black smoke, rolling and churning like a dark storm front. The sun, so bright and cheerful at dawn, was now just a pale, ghostly disk glowing weakly behind the ash. The harbor was a landscape of heartbreaking transformation. The quiet sanctuaries of steel were bleeding. The air was filled with the terrible, tearing sound of metal, the frantic hissing of escaping steam, and the low, mournful cries of men. The peaceful water of the bay, once a perfect mirror of the heavens, was churning and frothing, covered in a spreading blanket of dark, iridescent oil. And from the sky, the rain continued to fall. It was a rain of fire and iron, sweeping across the fleet with a cold, mechanical precision. Yet, amidst this overwhelming, sorrowful storm, the humanity of the sailors shone like a soft, inextinguishable light. A young mechanic, his face covered in dark soot, stood on the tilting deck of his ship. He was completely exposed to the sky, but he did not run for cover. Instead, he knelt beside a friend who had been struck down by a falling piece of debris. He cradled the injured boy's head in his lap, his blackened hands gently stroking his hair, whispering words of comfort that were lost in the roar of the engines above. He spoke of home, of baseball, of anything to keep the fear at bay. He stayed there, a quiet guardian in the center of the chaos, choosing to hold on to love while the world rained iron. Elsewhere on the deck, a young officer, barely older than the men he commanded, stood calmly near a shattered railing. The pristine white of his uniform was stained with ash and oil. He was not shouting orders or waving a weapon. He was simply reaching out his hand, over and over again, pulling exhausted, bewildered men from the rising water that was beginning to wash over the deck. His face was pale, his eyes wide with the shock of the morning, but his hand was perfectly steady. Every time he pulled a brother to safety, he offered a small, reassuring nod, a silent promise that they were not alone. In these desperate moments, the superficial differences that separated these men completely vanished. It no longer mattered if they were from the city or the country, if they were rich or poor, if they had been rivals or strangers just the day before. The terrible, sudden pressure of the morning had crushed away everything but their shared humanity. They were all simply boys far from home, bound together by the sudden, overwhelming need to survive, and more importantly, to help the man next to them survive. As the ships groaned and tilted, surrendering to the devastating weight of the water, the men continued to perform quiet, beautiful acts of sacrifice. They gave up their own life jackets to those who could not swim. They stepped aside at the narrow gangways, letting others pass to safety first. They ventured back down into the terrifying, smoky darkness of the lower decks, risking everything to search for a missing friend, guided only by the frantic tapping of a wrench against a bulkhead. They were not thinking of history. They were not thinking of the headlines that would be printed the next day, or the speeches that would be made. In the pure, distilled emotion of that Sunday morning, their world had narrowed to the space of a few feet around them. Their entire universe was the brother reaching out his hand, the friend calling out in the smoke, the desperate, beautiful urge to protect the fragile flame of life against the cold, falling iron. The rain of fire had shattered the peace of the island. It had broken the great steel ships and stained the perfect blue of the harbor. But as the men of Battleship Row held onto each other in the smoke and the ash, they proved that there are things in this world that cannot be broken by metal or fire. The quiet resilience, the tender, protective love they showed one another in the darkest moments of the morning remained completely intact. As they looked up at the bruised and broken sky, they were terrified, they were exhausted, and they were grieving. But as they stood shoulder to shoulder on the tilting decks, their hands gripping tightly to one another, they were not defeated. They were together, an unbreakable chain of humanity holding steady in the sudden, sorrowful storm. There is a sacred quiet that rests over the water, a heavy, beautiful stillness that feels like a held breath. If you look out across the gentle, rippling surface of the harbor today, the water is a brilliant, mesmerizing shade of blue-green. It sparkles under the bright Hawaiian sun, reflecting the passing white clouds and the soft shadows of the surrounding mountains. It looks like a place of perfect, undisturbed peace. But beneath this beautiful, shining mirror, resting quietly in the soft, dark silt of the ocean floor, lies a sleeping giant. It is a place where time simply stopped, capturing a single, perfect Sunday morning and holding it safe for all of eternity. Before the sky changed, the USS Arizona was not just a ship of steel and iron. It was a bustling, floating village. It was a home. For the boys who lived within her heavy gray walls, she was a sanctuary that carried them across the endless, rolling expanse of the Pacific. Inside her corridors, there was laughter. There were the rich, warm smells of baking bread and strong coffee. There were quiet corners where young men sat with worn pencils, chewing on the ends as they tried to find the perfect words to send back to a girl in a small town, or to a mother who worried about her son out on the deep water. Among the crew, there was a profound, woven tapestry of brotherhood. It was not just the bond of men who worked together. On the Arizona, there were dozens of actual brothers. There were sets of twins, older brothers looking out for younger ones, boys from the same porch steps in the Midwest who had promised their parents they would stay together, no matter where the Navy took them. They shared everything. They shared the cramped space of the bunks, they shared the sweet taste of fresh island pineapple, and they shared the quiet, unspoken homesickness that sometimes drifted over the ship when the stars came out. On that final, golden morning, the Arizona was waking up just like the rest of the island. The air was cool and sweet. Toward the back of the ship, under the sweeping canvas awnings, a group of young men had gathered with brass instruments. They were the ship's band. They were holding polished trumpets and silver trombones, arranging their sheet music as the gentle morning breeze flooded the pages. They were getting ready to play the morning colors, to fill the quiet harbor with music. Nearby, two brothers stood at the railing. The older brother reached out, gently straightening the white collar of his younger sibling's uniform. He brushed a speck of lint from the crisp cotton, a small, tender gesture of care that spoke volumes of the love he held. They leaned against the warm metal, looking out at the water, talking softly about the afternoon. They had plans to go ashore, perhaps to walk in the warm sand, or to find a place that sold cold milkshakes. They were entirely at peace. They were completely safe in each other's company, warmed by the rising sun, smiling at a joke only the two of them understood. And then, in a fraction of a single heartbeat, the world simply ceased to be. When the change came to the Arizona, it did not arrive as a long, drawn-out struggle. It arrived as a sudden, overwhelming flash of brilliant light. It was a force so immense, so entirely beyond the scale of human comprehension, that it bypassed fear completely. In one profound, shattering instant, the gentle morning was gone. The music stopped before the first note could truly carry across the water. For the young men standing on the decks, and for the hundreds of boys still resting in their bunks below, there was no time to be afraid. There was no time to reach out into the dark. There was only a sudden, blinding transition from the warm, sunlit air to an eternal, quiet sleep. The great ship, mortally wounded in her very heart, let out a deep, sorrowful sigh. And then, she simply let go. She did not fight the water. As the harbor rose up to meet her, the ocean acted not as an enemy, but as a gentle, extinguishing blanket. The water rushed in to cool the hot steel, to smother the flames, and to cradle the fallen. She settled into the soft mud of the harbor floor, wrapping her heavy iron arms around the boys she could no longer protect. She took them down into the quiet, cool dark, away from the smoke, away from the terrifying noise of the morning, pulling them into a deep and lasting sanctuary. It is a difficult thing for the human heart to hold, the idea of so much light, so much youth and promise, extinguished in a single breath. We think of the letters left unfinished on the small metal desks. We think of the pocket watches that stopped ticking, forever holding the hands at the exact moment the world broke. We think of the mothers waiting by screen doors in quiet towns, looking down the road for a boy who would now remain forever young, forever suspended in the Hawaiian sunshine of 1941. But there is a gentle grace in the way they rest. They did not face the long, bitter years of war that followed. They did not have to carry the heavy burdens of battle across foreign sands or freezing oceans. They were spared the slow, aching march of time. They are, all of them, resting exactly where they belong, together. The brothers are still side by side. The friends who laughed in the mess hall are still within arm's reach. They are surrounded by the boys who knew them best, held in an unbreakable circle of loyalty and love that not even the weight of the ocean can crush. And the ship herself has never forgotten them. If you stand above the water today, on the beautiful, white, curving bridge of the memorial that floats above her sunken hull, you will see a gentle, heartbreaking phenomenon. From deep within the rusted chambers of the ship, from the dark and quiet places where the boys still sleep, small drops of oil slowly break free. They rise through the blue-green water, delicate and perfectly round, floating up to the surface. When they hit the sunlight, they spread out into incredibly beautiful, iridescent ribbons of pink, gold, and violet. The people of the island call them the tears of the Arizona. Even now, after all the changing seasons, after all the turning pages of history, the ship still weeps. Drop by drop, she releases these dark, beautiful tears. It is a slow, rhythmic pulse, like the beating of a very quiet heart. It is as if the ship is breathing for the men who cannot. It is a continuous, gentle offering to the sky, a quiet reminder that the boys below are still there, that their story is still being told, and that their sacrifice has not simply dissolved into the past. Visitors from all over the world come to this quiet place. They walk softly across the white floors of the memorial. They speak in hushed, reverent whispers, instinctively lowering their voices so as not to wake the sleepers below. They stand at the marble wall, running their fingertips over the thousands of names carved into the cool stone. They read the names of the brothers. They read the names of the fathers and the sons. And then, they walk to the edge of the railing and look down into the water. They watch the black tears rise. Sometimes, they drop a single white flower into the water, watching it drift gently on the surface, casting a small, soft shadow over the submerged decks. Down below, beneath the white flowers and the rising oil, it is very peaceful. The sounds of the modern world, the airplanes passing high overhead, the hum of the city across the bay, do not reach them. They are wrapped in the deepest, most comforting silence. The gentle currents of the Pacific sweep softly through the broken portholes and the open hatches, carrying the clean, pure salt of the open ocean. Small, brightly colored fish dart through the shadows, bringing flashes of beautiful life to the quiet, rusted halls. The harbor holds them safe. It holds them close. The frantic, terrifying moments of that long-ago Sunday are entirely washed away, replaced by an eternal, soothing calm. Let us leave them to their rest. Let us close our eyes and send a quiet, loving thought down through the blue water, down into the dark, down to the boys who gave everything they had before the day had even truly begun. They are safe now. The storm is over. The water is still. And they are sleeping perfectly, beautifully together, rocked forever in the gentle, endless cradle of the deep. There is a special kind of heartbreak in watching something beautiful return to the earth in a shower of embers. Beyond the gentle, lapping waters of the harbor, where the island flattens out into wide, sprawling plains of sweet-smelling grass, lay the airfields. They were vast, open spaces of perfectly manicured green and smooth, pale concrete, built specifically to catch the wind. Here, the great silver birds of the sky rested in long, incredibly neat rows. They were lined up wingtip to wingtip, parked close together like a flock of sleeping doves, huddling for warmth in the cool, crisp air of the Hawaiian morning. To the rest of the world, these airplanes were just machines made of aluminum, canvas, and wire. But to the young men who tended them, they were something far more precious. The mechanics who walked the flight lines in the quiet, deeply peaceful hours before dawn knew every single rivet, every delicate wire, and every gentle curve of the fuselage. They spoke to the engines in low, affectionate whispers. They wiped the gathering morning dew from the heavy propellers with the same tender, careful devotion a father might use to wipe a smudge from his child's cheek. There was a young mechanic, a boy from the rolling, forested hills of Pennsylvania, whose hands were permanently stained with the dark oil of his trade. He kept a small, carefully folded letter from his mother tucked safely into the breast pocket of his coveralls. He had been up since long before the sun, sitting cross-legged on the wide wing of a pursuit plane, watching the sky slowly transition from a deep, velvety violet to a soft, peach-colored dawn. He loved the profound quiet out here on the tarmac. He loved the way the smell of the damp earth mixed with the sharp, clean scent of aviation fuel. He patted the cool metal of the wing, feeling a deep, quiet sense of pride. He was a caretaker of the sky. He was happy. When the distant rumble first began to vibrate through the thick rubber soles of his heavy boots, he simply thought the island wind was changing direction. He looked up, his eyes squinting against the rising sun. But as the shadows swept low over the WWII mountains, carrying the heavy, sorrowful roar of unfamiliar engines, the beautiful, glass-like sanctuary of the airfield was instantly broken. The sky did not just fall, it seemed to weep. The planes that had been sleeping so peacefully were suddenly enveloped in a blinding, terrifying storm. Because they were parked so closely together, trusting entirely in the safety of the island and the peace of the Sunday morning, the fire moved from one silver wing to the next like a quiet, devastating contagion. The canvas burned with a bright, intense heat, and the beautiful aluminum melted into glowing, sorrowful rivers that pooled slowly on the concrete. What happened next on those sprawling fields was not a story of anger or vengeance. It was a story of profound, desperate love. The mechanics and the young pilots did not run for the safety of the distant tree line. They did not hide in the dark bunkers. They ran directly into the blinding heat. They were just boys, wearing thin cotton shirts, armed with absolutely nothing but their bare hands and a fierce, deeply protective instinct. They did not want to fight, they only wanted to save the flock. Through the thick, choking curtains of black smoke, you could see the beautiful silhouettes of humanity moving together in perfect, urgent harmony. Groups of 5, 10, 20 young men threw their shoulders against the heavy rubber tires of the surviving aircraft. The heat was blistering, singing their eyebrows and turning the morning air into a suffocating oven, but they planted their feet firmly on the scorched earth and pushed. They pushed with every ounce of strength they possessed, groaning under the immense weight, desperately trying to roll the unburned planes away from the hungry flames. A young pilot, still wearing his light cotton pajamas, sprinted barefoot across the broken, hot tarmac. He was looking for his plane, his own silver bird, but the smoke was too thick, and the ash was blinding. He stumbled, falling hard onto the rough concrete, his breath catching in his throat as the dark ash fell around him like a heavy, sorrowful snow. Before he could even try to stand, strong hands were suddenly under his arms, lifting him gently back to his feet. It was a mechanic he barely knew, a boy whose face was entirely blackened by soot, save for the bright, shining whites of his terrified eyes. The mechanic didn't say a single word. He simply pulled the pilot close, shielding him with his own body as another shadow roared over the field, and then guided him softly toward the safety of a concrete wall. In the heart of the fire, they were no longer pilot and wrench-turner. They were brothers, bound by the sudden, overwhelming need to keep each other breathing. The ash fell continuously. It coated the green grass in a blanket of heavy, sorrowful gray. It drifted down like leaves in a quiet autumn wind, soft and completely silent, settling gently on the shoulders of the men who were fighting so hard. It filled the air with a dry, bitter taste, sticking to the sweat on their skin, but the young men refused to stop moving. In the corner of one burning hangar, where the metal roof was beginning to groan and sag under the intense heat, a young man heard a soft, terrified whimper. He paused, wiping the sweat and ash from his burning eyes, and peered into the thick smoke. Tucked away behind a stack of wooden shipping crates was a small, stray dog that had wandered onto the base a few weeks prior, quietly adopted by the crew as a gentle companion. The dog was shaking uncontrollably, paralyzed by the noise and the bright flames. Without a single second of hesitation, the young man dropped the heavy metal wrench he was holding. He dropped to his knees and crawled into the suffocating, dark space. He scooped the small, trembling creature into his arms, pulling off his heavy denim jacket and wrapping it completely around the dog to shield it from the falling sparks. He carried that small life out into the open air, holding it tightly against his chest, pressing his face into the soft fur. It was a tiny, beautiful victory of life amidst an overwhelming landscape of loss. It is a difficult, heartbreaking thing to describe the sorrow of a young man watching his aircraft burn. To these boys, the planes were not simply machines of war. They were extensions of their own bodies. They were the magical wings that allowed them to leave the earth and touch the soft white clouds. As the morning wore on, and the fires grew too large to fight with bare hands, many young men simply had to step back. Their faces were streaked with silent tears that cut clean, pale lines through the dark soot. They stood and watched as their beautiful silver birds were consumed by the bright orange flames. They stood shoulder to shoulder, leaning against one another, wrapping their arms around each other's waists. They mourned the loss of the planes with a quiet, devastating grief, as if they were standing at the bedside of a living, breathing friend who was quietly slipping away. When the sky finally emptied, and the strange, unfamiliar planes disappeared back into the high clouds, an incredibly heavy, mourning silence descended upon the airfields. The roaring of the engines was gone. It was replaced only by the soft, crackling whispers of the dying fires, the gentle hiss of water leaking from broken pipes, and the slow, exhausted breathing of the men. The survivors collapsed onto the damp grass at the very edge of the tarmac. They were utterly, profoundly exhausted. Their clothes were torn and stained, their hands were red and blistered, and their lungs ached with the heavy memory of the smoke. But as they sat there, covered entirely in the falling ash, they slowly began to look at each other. They saw the faces of men who had walked through the fire and emerged together. They saw a quiet, beautiful resilience that no bomb could ever touch. The boy from Pennsylvania, the one who loved the quiet mornings, reached a trembling, soot-stained hand into the pocket of his coveralls. His fingers gently brushed against the folded paper of his mother's letter. He pulled it out slowly. The edges of the paper were slightly singed, and it carried the sharp, bitter scent of the smoke, but the words were perfectly safe. He held it in his open palm, staring at the familiar, curving handwriting. It was a tiny, fragile piece of home. It was a beautiful reminder that beyond this broken, smoking morning, there was still a world filled with soft front porches, warm kitchens, and people who loved him unconditionally. A single tear slipped down his dark cheek, landing softly on the paper, and he carefully, tenderly tucked the letter back over his beating heart. The skies over the island wept in ash that day, covering the beautiful, idyllic paradise in a gray, sorrowful blanket. The great silver birds were broken, their magnificent wings clipped, their bodies resting quietly on the scorched earth. But the men who tended them were not broken. In the midst of the terrifying, sudden storm, they had found a quiet, towering strength within themselves. They had protected the fragile lives around them with a gentle, fierce devotion. As the afternoon sun struggled to pierce the thick canopy of smoke, casting a dim, golden, ethereal light over the ruined fields, the young men rested. They leaned their heavy heads against one another, closing their tired, burning eyes. They found a deep, lasting peace in the simple, beautiful fact that they had faced the fire, they had held on to their humanity, and they had survived the morning together. There is a darkness so absolute that it forces you to close your eyes, relying entirely on the gentle touch of the person beside you to know that you are still in the world. Far below the weather decks, deep within the heavy steel bellies of the great ships, the sudden chaos of the morning was experienced not as a visual storm, but as a profound, terrifying shift in the very foundation of the earth. Down here, there was no sky to watch. There were no falling shadows to see. There was only the thick, familiar embrace of the metal bulkheads, the narrow passageways painted in pale colors, and the warm, close air filled with the scent of wool and machinery. When the devastating blows finally struck the sides of these floating sanctuaries, the world simply tilted, groaning with a deep, sorrowful sound that vibrated right through the soles of the young men's shoes. And then, with a heavy, final sigh, the electricity failed. The lights, which had burned with such a steady, reassuring glow just a moment before, popped and faded into nothing. The sudden absence of light was not just a shadow, it was a thick, heavy blanket that fell over everything. In the blink of an eye, the boys were plunged into a pitch-black abyss, a darkness so thick and complete that it felt like it had its own terrible weight. As the great ships began to lean, surrendering slowly to the immense, rushing power of the sea, the ocean stepped inside. The water did not arrive with malice, but it poured through the broken seams of the hulls with a cold, unstoppable determination. It rose around their ankles, a freezing, shocking contrast to the warm Hawaiian morning they had woken up to. In this overwhelming dark, trapped in small compartments as the water began to slowly rise, the human heart was tested in the most unimaginable way. Yet, what bloomed in those terrifying, isolated pockets of air was not a wild, selfish panic. What bloomed was an incredibly beautiful, heartbreaking display of purest love. When you cannot see the face of the boy standing next to you, and when the deafening roar of the outside world is muffled by layers of thick, groaning iron, the only thing left is to reach out. Fingers grasped blindly in the dark. Hands searched through the rising water and the empty air until they brushed against the rough cotton of a uniform or the damp, trembling skin of a friend's shoulder. They held on. They held on to each other with a fierce, tender desperation. A boy from the rolling plains of Texas found the hand of a boy from the crowded, noisy streets of Brooklyn, and in that pitch-black space, their differences dissolved entirely. They interlocked their fingers, squeezing tightly, anchoring one another against the terrifying tilt of the floor. "I am here," one voice would whisper into the dark, his breath trembling just slightly. "I have you," another voice would answer, soft and close. These were not soldiers in this moment. They were just young men, deeply aware of their own fragility, turning to each other for the only comfort left in the world. They huddled together in the highest corners of the compartments, pulling their knees to their chests, pressing their shoulders tightly against one another to share whatever warmth they had left. The water sloshed gently around them, a cold, continuous reminder of the ocean's presence, but above the waterline, there was a quiet, sacred space of humanity. To keep the fear from swallowing them whole, they began to speak. They did not talk about the war. They did not talk about the terrifying sounds of the ship settling into the mud. They used their voices to paint beautiful, vivid pictures in the dark, transporting themselves far away from the cold steel. One young sailor, his voice remarkably steady, began to describe his mother's kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with deliberate care, so that every boy in the room could see it. He described the way the golden afternoon light would filter through the lace curtains, casting soft shadows on the linoleum floor. He talked about the sweet, heavy smell of apples and cinnamon baking in the oven, and the comforting, rhythmic sound of a wooden spoon tapping against a ceramic bowl. As he spoke, the boys closed their eyes. For a few precious minutes, they were no longer trapped in the belly of a sinking ship. They were standing in that warm, sunlit kitchen. They could almost taste the cinnamon. They could almost feel the safe, loving presence of a mother's hand brushing against their cheek. Another boy began to softly recite a poem he had learned in a small, wooden schoolhouse many years ago. It was a simple rhyme about the changing seasons, about the soft falling of the snow and the quiet arrival of spring. His voice was a gentle murmur, a rhythmic lullaby that washed over the rising fear, soothing the racing hearts of the boys huddled around him. In the tightest, most terrifying corners, where the air was growing thin and heavy with the smell of oil, some boys closed their eyes and whispered quiet prayers. They were not prayers of screaming desperation, but soft, gentle pleas sent out into the universe. They prayed for the safety of their families. They prayed for the girls they had promised to marry. They prayed for the brothers sitting right beside them in the dark. The familiar, rhythmic cadence of the Lord's Prayer floated through the blackness, a shared, sacred chant that bound their spirits together. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. The words were a quiet, steadying heartbeat against the chaotic groaning of the dying ship. And then, there was the tapping. Down in the depths of the ocean, the thick steel hull of a battleship is a heavy, soundproof wall. Shouting does no good, the voice simply bounces off the iron and fades away. But steel carries vibrations. Steel can carry a message. A young mechanic, trapped in an air pocket near the very bottom of the ship, found a heavy metal wrench in the dark. With his breathing shallow and slow, trying to conserve the precious oxygen, he lifted his tired arm and struck the heavy bulkhead. Clang, he paused, listening to the heavy silence of the water. He lifted his arm and struck it again. Asterisk clang. Clang, asterisk, it was an ancient, desperate language. It was a plea, a beacon sent out into the unknown. It was the simple, heartbreaking statement, asterisk, we are still here. Please do not forget us, asterisk, he tapped a steady, rhythmic pattern. Some boys tapped in Morse code, spelling out their names or the number of men in their compartment. Others simply tapped a slow, steady heartbeat, a continuous proof of life echoing through the rusted pipes and the bending iron. They took turns, passing the wrench or the hammer from one exhausted hand to another, ensuring that the heavy, ringing sound never completely stopped. And then, a miracle happened. From the outside, from the bright, sunlit world above the surface of the water, a vibration answered. A sailor pressed his ear flat against the cold, damp steel of the wall. He closed his eyes, holding his breath, telling the boys around him to be perfectly still. Through the heavy iron, he felt a faint, distant tremor. Asterisk tap. Tap. Tap, asterisk, it was a rescue crew. It was a team of men standing on the overturned hull of the ship, armed with hammers and cutting torches, tapping back. The profound, overwhelming wave of relief that washed through that dark compartment is impossible to measure. To the boys trapped inside, that distant, muffled sound was the most beautiful music they had ever heard. It meant they were not alone. It meant the world had not simply abandoned them to the dark. It meant that someone, somewhere up in the light, knew exactly where they were and was fighting to bring them home. They tapped back with renewed, frantic energy, a conversation of pure love spoken entirely through the vibration of metal. It was a delicate, invisible thread connecting the men in the dark to the men in the light. But as the hours slowly stretched into the afternoon, and the afternoon faded into a long, terrifying night, the reality of the thick steel and the deep water began to press down. In many compartments, the rescue torches simply could not cut through the heavy armor plating fast enough. The tapping from the outside grew fainter, and the water continued its slow, silent creep upward. It is here, in these final, quiet hours, that the true, enduring beauty of their spirits shone the brightest. When the realization softly settled over them that the metal was too thick, and that the beautiful, bright world above was slipping out of reach, they did not turn on one another. They did not surrender to a frantic, clawing panic. Instead, they leaned closer. They shared the last sips of fresh water from a single canteen, carefully passing it from hand to hand so that everyone had a taste. They took off their dry shirts and wrapped them around the shoulders of the boys who were shivering in the cold water. They continued to hold hands, their grips softening from a desperate clutch to a gentle, loving hold. In the quiet dark, a boy rested his tired head against the shoulder of his best friend. They sat there, bathed in the heavy silence, listening to the slow, rhythmic breathing of the men around them. "Tell me about the snow again," the boy whispered, his eyes heavy and ready for sleep. His friend smiled into the darkness, squeezing his hand. And in a soft, gentle voice, he began to describe the way the snowflakes drifted down from the gray winter sky, catching on the branches of the pine trees, covering the world in a pure, peaceful, and perfectly white blanket. They drifted away on the wings of those beautiful memories. They fell asleep surrounded by the profound, comforting warmth of brotherhood. They were entirely wrapped in love. The dark compartments of those sunken ships were not places of horror in those final moments. They became quiet, sacred chapels. There were spaces completely defined by selflessness, by the gentle courage of a hand held in the dark, and by the soothing power of a shared whisper. As we think of them resting there, we must not picture the cold water or the heavy steel. We must picture the invisible, unbreakable bonds of love that filled that space. We must remember the gentle tapping of the wrenches, the quiet recitation of poetry, and the beautiful, selfless way they carried one another through the darkest hours. They were together. They were loved. And in the quiet, gentle sleep that finally claimed them, they found a peace that the broken world above could never, ever touch. There is a miraculous, quiet strength found in the simple act of reaching out a hand when the world is covered in shadows. The waters of the harbor, which only hours before had been a perfect, tranquil mirror reflecting the soft blue of the morning sky, had changed into something entirely unrecognizable. The great ships, wounded in the dawn, had spilled their lifeblood into the sea. A thick, heavy blanket of dark oil now coated the gentle waves. It was a dark, suffocating veil that spread out across the bay, hiding the clean, green water beneath. And then, the impossible happened, the water itself began to burn. Small islands of fire danced across the surface, casting long, wavering reflections that painted the surrounding smoke in hues of deep orange, sorrowful gray, and bruised purple. To the boys who were forced to leave the tilting decks of their floating homes, the water was no longer a familiar friend. It was a terrifying, unknown expanse. With the steel decks groaning beneath their feet, they had no choice but to step off the edge and fall into the heavy darkness below. When they broke the surface, the shock was profound. The water beneath the burning oil was startlingly cold, a sharp contrast to the blistering heat above. But it was the oil itself that was the hardest to bear. It clung to their white uniforms, turning the crisp cotton into heavy, leaden weights. It coated their skin and stung their eyes, a thick, blinding barrier that made every single movement a slow, exhausting struggle. They did not swim with the easy, joyful grace of a summer afternoon on the beach. They moved with a desperate, heavy yearning, their arms aching, simply trying to keep their faces above the dark water and find a breath of clear air. Yet, they were not abandoned to the dark. Out from the shorelines, out from the untouched piers and the quiet edges of the island, came the small boats. They were not grand warships made of impenetrable steel. They were tiny, fragile, deeply ordinary things. They were wooden motor launches, rowboats, captain's gigs, and even small, civilian pleasure craft that had been resting quietly in the marina. They bobbed on the churning water like fallen leaves, driven forward by young men whose hearts were beating wildly in their chests. Picture a young sailor standing at the helm of one of these small wooden boats. He is just a boy, really, his white canvas hat pulled low over his eyes to shield them from the intense glare of the flames. His hands grip the wooden steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles are entirely white. He is terrified. The smoke stings his throat, and the heavy roar of the morning presses down against his ears like a physical weight. Every instinct in his young body is telling him to turn the boat around, to head back to the safety of the shore, to the quiet, green grass where the world still makes sense and the air is sweet. But he looks out across the burning bay, and he sees the silhouettes of his brothers bobbing in the dark water. He does not turn the wheel away. He swallows his fear, a quiet, invisible victory of the human spirit, and he steers his little wooden boat directly into the smoke. The soft, rhythmic put-put-put of his small engine is a tiny, comforting heartbeat against the vast, sorrowful symphony of the harbor. He navigates through the maze of floating debris, his eyes squinting through the ash, searching the water. Then, he sees it. A solitary hand, covered in dark oil, reaching up from the heavy waves. The young coxswain immediately cuts the engine, letting the boat glide softly toward the hand. He leans over the side of the wooden hull, ignoring the searing heat that singes the fine hairs on his arms. He reaches his own hands, hands that used to mend fishing nets in a quiet coastal town, hands that had written a letter to his mother just the night before, down into the dark, slick water. When their hands finally meet, it is a clumsy, slippery collision. The oil makes it nearly impossible to hold on. The boy in the water is utterly exhausted, his limbs heavy, his spirit flickering like a candle in the wind. He begins to slip backward. But the young coxswain refuses to let go. He plants his knees firmly against the wooden floorboards, his muscles shaking with the immense, quiet effort of lifting another human soul. With a slow, agonizing pull, driven entirely by a fierce and protective love, he draws the boy up from the water and over the side of the boat. They collapse together onto the bottom of the launch, panting heavily in the smoke-filled air. The rescuer does not ask for the boy's name. He does not ask where he is from. He simply reaches out with the sleeve of his own uniform, gently wiping the heavy, dark oil from the boy's trembling eyes, and whispers a soft, soothing promise, "You are safe now. I have got you." Somewhere else in the vast, churning bay, another young man is floating on his back. The water is so cold, and he is so incredibly tired. He closes his heavy eyes, shutting out the orange glow of the sky. In the quiet darkness of his own mind, he travels far away from the harbor. He thinks of a wooden porch swing in Georgia. He hears the sound of his younger sister laughing as she chases fireflies in the twilight. He can almost smell the sweet, earthy scent of rain falling on a dusty country road. He feels himself drifting, ready to surrender to the heavy, peaceful pull of the deep water. He is not afraid anymore. He is just incredibly weary, ready to sleep. But before he can slip away into the quiet dark, a shadow blocks out the light above him. He hears the soft splash of oars dipping into the water. A voice calls out to him, a voice trembling with desperation and deep, abiding care. A long, wooden oar is extended down toward his chest. He opens his eyes, reaches out, and grabs the rough, splintered wood. He feels the solid, undeniable tether of life in his palms, and he allows himself to be pulled back to the surface, back to the world, back to his brothers. These small, open boats became floating sanctuaries. They crisscrossed the burning harbor in a slow, continuous, beautiful dance of salvation. The young men driving them returned to the shore again and again, dropping off their quiet, shivering cargo onto the safe concrete before turning their little boats right back around and heading into the danger once more. Their crisp, white uniforms were entirely stained black. Their faces were coated in dark soot, their hands blistered, scorched, and sore. Yet, they moved with a gentle, methodical grace. They were driven by a profound, unbreakable bond, an invisible thread of brotherhood that tied every single boy in the harbor together. They did not stop to rest. They did not stop to consider their own weariness. As long as there was a hand reaching out from the water, they would be there to catch it. Inside the small boats, as they slowly motored back toward the shore, a quiet, sacred peace settled over the rescued men. They huddled together on the wooden benches, shivering in the morning air, wrapped in whatever could be found, a dry jacket, a piece of rough canvas, a clean towel offered by a stranger on a passing tugboat. They leaned their tired heads against one another, forming small, human circles of warmth and comfort. One sailor, sitting in the back of a motor launch, had hands that were badly burned from sliding down a rope. He sat quietly, staring down at his lap. Beside him, another boy found a small, metal canteen of fresh water rolling on the floorboards. The boy did not drink for himself. He unscrewed the metal cap with trembling fingers, leaned over, and gently lifted the canteen to the lips of his injured friend. The burned sailor drank the cool, sweet water, closing his eyes in a moment of pure, profound relief. He offered a small, barely perceptible nod of thanks. It was a beautiful, silent communion. It was a gentle reminder that even in the midst of the darkest, most terrifying storms, the purest forms of human kindness do not just survive, they shine brighter than the fires themselves. As the morning slowly stretched on, the bay was filled with these small, quiet acts of grace. The grand, magnificent steel behemoths had fallen to the mud, but the tiny wooden boats remained on the surface. They were a beautiful testament to a truth that is as old as the ocean itself. The true strength of a fleet, the true power of a nation, is never found in its armor or its engines. It is always, entirely, found in the hearts of the boys who wear the uniform. The fire would eventually burn itself out. The dark smoke would eventually thin, carried away by the gentle Hawaiian trade winds, leaving the sky clear and blue once again. But the memory of those reaching hands, slipping and holding fast in the dark, oil-slicked water, remains forever. It is a lullaby of quiet courage that drifts across the years. It is a soft, enduring promise, whispered from one generation to the next, that no matter how deep the water gets, no matter how fierce the fire burns around you, you are never truly alone. There will always be a brother in a small wooden boat, steering through the dark, coming to bring you home. Close your eyes, and let the gentle rhythm of the water soothe you. You can almost hear the soft, distant hum of the motor. You can hear the gentle splash of the oars lifting from the sea. And if you listen very closely, you can hear the beautiful, calming sound of a voice reaching through the dark, saying the words we all long to hear: hold on. I am here. You are safe. There is a profound and holy grace in the hands of those who stand in the doorway of sorrow, offering only a gentle touch and a quiet promise of care. Long before the sky broke open, the hospitals scattered across the island of Oahu were places of immaculate, quiet routine. In the gentle light of the early morning, the wards were bathed in a soft, welcoming stillness. The long rows of narrow beds were made with perfect, crisp precision, the white cotton sheets pulled tight and smooth. The air inside was cool and carried the clean, reassuring scents of rubbing alcohol, fresh linen, and the faint, sweet perfume of ginger flowers drifting in through the open windows. The nurses walked the polished hallways with a silent, graceful rhythm. Their uniforms were a blinding, pristine white, their caps pinned perfectly to their hair. They were young women, many of them far from their own homes, who had chosen a life dedicated to the quiet art of mending. They moved from bed to bed in the dawn light, checking a chart, adjusting a pillow, pouring a small cup of fresh water. They spoke in hushed, musical whispers, protective of the sleep of those in their care. It was a world entirely built on the foundation of gentleness. When the distant rumbling first began to shake the glass of the tall windows, the nurses and the young doctors simply paused. They looked out toward the horizon, watching the dark plumes of smoke begin to rise above the distant harbor. They did not know the shape of the storm that had just arrived, but their hearts, trained to respond to the suffering of others, instantly understood that their quiet sanctuary was about to change. There was no panic in the hallways. There was only a deep, collective intake of breath. The women in white and the men with their stethoscopes set aside their own private fears. They tucked their own worries for brothers and friends away in the quiet corners of their minds, locking them behind doors they would not open until the day was done. They rolled up their sleeves. They gathered the clean bandages, they filled the basins with warm water, and they stood by the wooden double doors, waiting to receive the broken pieces of the morning. When the first vehicles arrived, the pristine white of the hospital met the dark, heavy sorrow of the harbor. The young men who were carried through the doors did not look like the sailors who had walked the sunny streets of Honolulu the day before. They were completely covered in the thick, suffocating black oil of the sunken ships. Their faces were hidden behind masks of dark soot and gray ash. They were shivering, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming, terrifying shock of the morning. Their eyes were wide, searching the brightly lit hallways for an anchor, for a sign that the falling sky could no longer reach them. The healers stepped forward. They did not see the heavy oil or the terrible ruin. They only saw the frightened boys beneath it all. A young nurse, barely older than the sailor who was gently placed on the cot before her, knelt beside the bed. The boy was breathing heavily, his hands clutching blindly at the air because his eyes were entirely sealed shut by the thick, burning fuel. He was terrified of the dark. He whispered a frantic, broken question, asking if he was entirely alone. The nurse did not reach for her medical instruments. She reached for a soft, damp cloth. She leaned in close, so close that he could feel the warmth of her breath, and she took his trembling, well-stained hand in her own clean, white one. She did not care that the dark soot immediately stained her pristine uniform. "You are not alone," she whispered, her voice a steady, soothing melody in the chaotic room. "I am right here with you. You are safe now. Let me help you see." With infinite, agonizing patience, she began to bathe his face. She moved the warm cloth over his skin with the delicate care of a mother washing a sleeping child. She spoke to him the entire time, anchoring his racing mind to the gentle sound of her voice. She asked him about his hometown, about the girl whose name he kept murmuring in the dark. Slowly, the heavy black veil was lifted away. When the boy finally fluttered his eyelashes and opened his eyes, the very first thing he saw in the blurry light was her face, looking down at him with an expression of pure, unfiltered love. The tension melted from his shoulders, and he let out a long, shuddering sigh, finally allowing himself to rest. Across the ward, the young doctors were moving through the rows of cots. They were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the sorrow, their minds racing to keep up with the need, but their hands remained incredibly steady. They possessed a quiet, towering strength that radiated outward, calming the air around them. One doctor, his white coat now heavy with the ash and water of the harbor, stopped at the bedside of a young man who could not stop trembling. The boy was not terribly wounded, but his spirit was entirely fractured by the noise and the suddenness of the fire. The doctor knew that there was no medicine in his black bag that could cure the invisible wounds of the heart. So, he pulled up a small wooden chair and sat down. He set his stethoscope aside. He reached out and placed his large, warm hand gently over the boy's racing heart, resting it flat against his chest. He sat there in silence for a long time, becoming a human shield against the memories of the morning. He breathed in a slow, rhythmic pattern, deeply and evenly, until the young sailor's breathing naturally began to match his own. It was a profound, silent transmission of peace. The doctor did not leave the chair until the boy's eyes drifted closed, carried away into a safe, dreamless sleep by the simple, grounding weight of another human being's presence. As the afternoon stretched on, the hospital transformed into a beautiful, heartbreaking tapestry of community. The women of the island, mothers, grandmothers, and young girls from the surrounding neighborhoods, heard the distant sirens and came walking up the hills. They wore simple cotton dresses and brought whatever they had. They carried armfuls of clean white sheets from their own clotheslines, tearing them into long, soft strips to be used as bandages. They brought woven baskets filled with fresh, cool fruit from their gardens, offering sweet slices of papaya and mango to the parched, exhausted boys. The wards were filled with a gentle, continuous hum of human connection. In the quiet corners, away from the bustling center of the rooms, small, incredibly intimate moments were unfolding. A nurse sat on the edge of a bed, holding a small notepad and a fountain pen. The sailor lying beside her had his hands heavily wrapped in thick white gauze. He was staring up at the ceiling, his brow furrowed with the heavy burden of worry. He asked the nurse, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, if she would mind writing a letter for him. He needed his mother to know that he was still in the world. The nurse smiled softly, a gentle, reassuring light in her tired eyes. She uncapped her pen and nodded, resting the paper on her knee. The boy dictated his thoughts slowly, searching for the right words. He did not speak of the fire. He did not tell his mother about the terrifying noise of the planes or the dark, rising water in the belly of his ship. Instead, he spoke of the soft hospital bed. He spoke of the kind women who were giving him cool water to drink. He told her that the Hawaiian breeze was blowing through the window and that he was feeling much better. He asked her not to worry, and he told her to kiss his younger sister for him. The nurse wrote every word with painstaking care, her handwriting elegant and flowing. As she wrote the final words, "I love you," a single, quiet tear slipped down her cheek, completely hidden from the boy. She folded the letter, slipping it into an envelope, sealing inside it not just the boy's words, but her own silent prayer for the mother who would eventually open it on a quiet porch thousands of miles away. The healers carried an immense, invisible burden that day. They absorbed the shock, the grief, and the terror of hundreds of young men, acting as a soft, protective sponge against the sharp edges of the tragedy. They did not stop to eat. They did not stop to rest their aching feet. They simply moved from one cot to the next, driven by a well of compassion that seemed to have no bottom. When the sun finally began to sink below the horizon, painting the Hawaiian sky in breathtaking, sorrowful shades of deep violet and bruised gold, a heavy, profound quiet descended upon the wards. The bright overhead lights were turned off, leaving only the soft, warm glow of the small lamps resting on the bedside tables. The frantic energy of the day dissolved into the gentle, rhythmic sound of hundreds of young men finally sleeping. The nurses and doctors walked the darkened aisles, their silhouettes moving softly against the dim light. Their uniforms were no longer pristine. They were wrinkled, stained, and completely exhausted, but they possessed a beauty that was entirely transcendent. They were angels of the wards, keeping the night at bay. A nurse paused by a window, looking out at the dark silhouette of the mountains against the starry sky. She leaned her tired forehead against the cool glass, letting out a long, slow breath. The world outside was broken, fractured in a way that she knew would take a lifetime to mend. But as she turned and looked back at the long rows of sleeping boys, she saw the undeniable proof of something stronger than the iron that had fallen from the sky. She saw the quiet resilience of the human heart. She saw the incredible, soothing power of a hand held in the dark. She walked back down the aisle, her rubber-soled shoes making no sound on the floor. She stopped by a cot where a young sailor was tossing restlessly in his sleep, a frown creasing his forehead as the shadows of the morning chased him into his dreams. She reached out, placing her cool, soft hand gently against his brow. She hummed a low, sweet melody, a gentle island lullaby that floated over his pillow like a warm breeze. The boy's face softened. His breathing slowed, and the frown melted away, replaced by the profound, peaceful innocence of youth. Let the image of that quiet ward stay with you. Let the soft light of the bedside lamps push away the darkness of the history books. The healers of that day proved that even when the world is at its most terrifying, there will always be those who rush forward with open arms. There will always be a gentle voice in the smoke, a steady hand in the trembling dark, and a soft, whispered promise that no matter how deep the sorrow, love will always be there to wash away the ashes and sit with you until the morning comes. There is a strange and fragile moment when a distant storm first casts its shadow over a sunlit garden. Beyond the harbor, where the emerald slopes of the Ko'olau Mountains cradle the city of Honolulu, Sunday morning was unfolding in a slow, sweet rhythm. The wooden houses, with their wide, breezy lanais, sat peacefully beneath the shade of sprawling banyan trees. The air in these deep valleys was heavy with the fragrance of plumeria and damp earth, a gentle, intoxicating perfume that belonged entirely to the islands. Families were sitting down to breakfast tables draped in simple cotton cloths. There were slices of bright orange papaya, the soft clinking of silver spoons against delicate porcelain cups, and the quiet, comforting murmur of radios playing a light, cheerful island melody. In these quiet neighborhoods, the world felt infinitely safe. The vast ocean was a protective moat, and the tall, green mountains were sleeping guardians holding the world at bay. But sound travels differently in the valleys. It rolls. It gathers a heavy, sorrowful weight as it bounces off the high, green ridges. When the first deep echoes of the harbor reached the civilian streets, they did not sound like the breaking of the world. They sounded like a heavy, unseasonal thunder, a low rumble that vibrated gently through the wooden floorboards and rattled the teacups softly in their saucers. A mother, standing at her kitchen sink with her hands submerged in warm, soapy water, paused and looked out the window. The sky above her garden was perfectly blue, painted with the golden brushstrokes of the morning sun. But a strange, rhythmic thrumming was pressing against the glass. She dried her hands on her cotton apron, a slow furrow appearing on her brow, and stepped out onto the back porch. Up and down the winding street, doors were opening. Neighbors, still dressed in their soft morning robes, stepped out onto their lawns, shielding their eyes against the glare of the sun. They looked toward the south, toward the unseen water, where a thick, dark bruise was beginning to form against the horizon. There was no immediate panic. The human mind, cradled in peace for so long, instinctively seeks peaceful explanations. Perhaps it is a drill, they whispered over the low wooden fences. Perhaps a cane field has caught fire in the dry morning wind. They stood there in the dew-drenched grass, perfectly innocent, watching the dark column of smoke rise like a silent, sorrowful monument into the heavens. But then, the shadows swept over the rooftops. They came low, flying fast just above the swaying tops of the palm trees. To the children playing in the yards, they were a sudden, overwhelming marvel. A little boy, holding a wooden toy boat, stood frozen in his driveway. He watched the silver underbellies of the planes flash in the sunlight, completely mesmerized by the sheer speed and the deafening, vibrating roar that filled his chest. He did not know what the red circles on the wings meant. He only knew that the sky was suddenly, impossibly alive. As the morning wore on, the idyllic paradise began to change, quietly and completely. The gentle trade winds, which usually carried the sweet scent of sea salt and blooming hibiscus, suddenly shifted. They brought something new, something heavy and bitter. It began to snow in Honolulu. It was not the cold, sparkling snow of the mainland winters, but a soft, silent falling of dark ash. It drifted down from the blackened sky like delicate, gray feathers. It settled on the wide green leaves of the banana trees. It coated the brightly painted mailboxes and dusted the warm rooftops. A little girl, no older than 5, stood on her porch and reached out a small, curious hand. A single flake of ash landed softly on her palm. She looked down at it, rubbing it gently between her thumb and forefinger, leaving a dark, powdery smudge on her skin. She looked up at her mother, her wide eyes filled with a gentle, unquestioning confusion. "What is it, Mama?" she asked, her voice a soft, bird-like chirp in the heavy air. Her mother knelt down, taking the little girl's small hands in her own. Her heart was beating a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a deep, sudden understanding blooming in her chest, but she did not let it show on her face. She smoothed her daughter's hair, forcing a gentle, reassuring smile. "It's just dust from the mountains, my sweet," she whispered, pulling the child close to her chest. "But we need to go inside now. We are going to play a quiet game in the hallway." All across the valleys, this quiet, fiercely protective instinct took hold. The mothers and fathers of the island did not run screaming through the streets. They moved with a hushed, determined grace. They gathered their children, leaving the breakfast tables entirely untouched, the tea slowly cooling in the cups. They retreated into the deepest, safest parts of their homes. In a narrow, windowless hallway, one family sat huddled together on a woven rug. The father had pulled a heavy mattress from the bedroom, leaning it against the wall to create a soft, protective barrier. He sat with his arms wrapped tightly around his wife and their 2 young sons. The house around them trembled periodically, a deep, sorrowful shudder that seemed to rise up from the very roots of the island. To keep the boys from being afraid, the father began to tell a story. He kept his voice low and steady, a soothing baritone that anchored them in the dim light. He told them an old legend of the Hawaiian Islands, of a great, wise sea turtle who carried the mountains on his back. Every time the floorboards vibrated, he smiled gently, kissed the top of his son's head, and whispered, "There goes the turtle, shifting his weight. He is just making himself comfortable in the sand." The boys listened, their heads resting against his chest, their breathing slowly sinking with the calm, steady rhythm of his heart. They were afraid of the loud noises outside, but wrapped in the strong, unyielding embrace of their father, they felt completely safe. It was a beautiful, invisible fortress built entirely of love. As the long, strange hours of the Sunday passed, the community began to reach out to one another. The telephone lines were unreliable, filled with static and crossed signals, so the gentle connections were made by foot. A grandmother, carrying a woven basket, walked softly across her yard to the house next door. She knocked lightly on the screen door. When her neighbor opened it, her eyes red and heavy with worry, the older woman simply reached out and handed her a warm loaf of sweet bread wrapped in a clean, white towel. "We baked this early this morning," she said softly, her voice carrying the profound wisdom and calm of many years. "You must eat. You must keep your strength. We are all together in this." They stood on the porch, two women from different walks of life, holding hands as the ash continued to fall around them. They did not speak of the terrifying news trickling in over the radio. They did not speak of the fear that hung heavy in the valleys. They simply stood together, sharing a profound, silent promise that they would look after one another, no matter what the changing world brought to their peaceful shores. By the late afternoon, the roar of the engines finally ceased, replaced by an incredibly heavy, morning silence. The sun began to set behind the WWII mountains, casting long, sorrowful shadows across the island. But this evening would not be like the thousands of peaceful evenings before it. The authorities had called for a complete and total blackout. The island, which normally sparkled like a beautiful jewel box in the dark, had to completely disappear. In every house, families moved quietly, taping heavy black paper over their windows, pulling thick wool blankets across the glass. They unscrewed the light bulbs on their porches. They extinguished their stoves. Inside, they gathered around a single, dim candle placed in the center of the room, or they simply sat in the absolute dark. The transition was jarring. The beautiful, open, breezy paradise they had always known had been suddenly sealed shut. The air inside the houses grew warm, close, and suffocatingly still. Yet, even in this heavy dark, there was a quiet, enduring beauty. In one house, a young woman sat on the floor, holding her newborn baby in her arms. The baby was fussy, unsettled by the strange energy of the day and the stifling heat of the closed room. The mother did not turn on a light. She simply rocked back and forth in the dark, holding the small, fragile child close to her skin. She began to sing. It was a soft, slow lullaby, a gentle melody her own mother had sung to her many years ago. The sound of her voice floated through the dark room, sweet, clear, and perfectly calm. It drifted out through the small cracks around the edges of the heavy blackout curtains, traveling softly through the silent, sleeping neighborhood. A neighbor, sitting in his own dark living room across the street, heard the faint, beautiful melody. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against his chair, and let out a long, slow breath. The sound of that singing mother was the most comforting thing he had heard all day. It was a reminder that life, with all its tender, quiet, and deeply human moments, was still continuing. The world had changed, the innocence of the morning had been completely washed away, but the deep, abiding love of a mother for her child remained perfectly untouched. The lush, green valleys of Oahu echoed with many things that day. They echoed with the terrifying thunder of a breaking world. They echoed with the sirens, the rumors, and the heavy sorrow of the harbor. But if you close your eyes and listen closely to the memory of that day, beneath the noise and the shadows, you will hear the softer, truer echoes. You will hear the gentle rustle of a mattress being pulled into a hallway to protect a frightened family. You will hear the soft knock on a screen door and the beautiful offering of warm bread. You will hear the soothing, steady voice of a father telling a story in the dark. These are the echoes of everyday heroism. They are the quiet, profound moments of resilience that carried the people of the island through the darkest night they had ever known. They went to sleep that Sunday in a world completely altered, their windows covered and their hearts incredibly heavy. But they went to sleep together. They went to sleep knowing that the gentle, protective spirit of their community was a light that no darkness, no matter how deep, could ever truly extinguish. There is a fragile, desperate hope that settles in the quiet moments just after a storm, a whispered prayer that the worst has finally passed. For a brief, suspended span of time, a strange and heavy lull fell over the smoking waters of the harbor. The terrifying roar of the first shadows had faded into the distance, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence. It was a silence filled only with the crackle of burning oil, the gentle lapping of the dark waves against the wounded steel, and the exhausted, ragged breathing of the men who had just survived the end of their world. The young sailors and soldiers, coated in ash and soaked in the heavy waters of the bay, leaned against whatever they could find. They rested their heavy heads against the cool concrete of the piers or the tilted bulkheads of their ships. They looked at one another with wide, hollow eyes, their faces painted with dark soot and the pale tracks of silent tears. In their hearts, clinging to the last remnants of the morning's innocence, they believed the nightmare was over. They believed that the sky had emptied its sorrow, and that now, the long, painful work of healing could begin. Hands that were shaking only moments before began to gently reach out to bandage the wounded. Small, quiet words of comfort were exchanged in the smoke. A boy offered his canteen to a stranger, his thumb gently wiping away the grime from the metal rim before passing it over. In this fragile window of peace, the human spirit instinctively turned toward the light, eager to sweep away the broken glass and tend to the fallen. But the sky, bruised and churning with thick, dark clouds, had not yet finished its weeping. It began as a vibration, a faint, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to travel through the thick, gray air before it even reached the ear. It was a sound they had all come to recognize in the span of a single hour. A young sailor, kneeling on a scorched deck with a roll of white cotton bandages in his hands, slowly lifted his head. The cloth slipped from his fingers, unrolling across the soot-stained metal. He did not run. He simply stared up into the haze. Beside him, an older officer closed his eyes, letting out a long, slow breath that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. Through the veil of smoke, they appeared again. A second flock of dark birds, sweeping down from the clouds, their wings casting fresh, terrifying shadows over the broken fleet. This moment, the arrival of the second wave, brought a unique and devastating kind of sorrow. It was the heavy, sinking realization that this was not a fleeting mistake. It was not a single, isolated nightmare from which they would soon awake. It was a continuing reality. The protective bubble of their paradise had not just been punctured, it had been entirely washed away. Yet, as the sky began to tear open once more, something profound shifted within the hearts of the boys on the harbor. The initial shock, the stunning disbelief that had paralyzed them in the early dawn, was entirely gone. The innocence had been burned away, leaving behind something harder, quieter, and deeply magnificent. They did not panic. They did not scramble blindly for cover in the dark. Instead, they found a grim, unwavering resilience rising up from the very depths of their souls. Picture a young man from a quiet farming town, standing near a heavy gun on the deck of a ship. His uniform is torn, his face smeared with grease, and his hands are badly blistered from the heat of the morning. When the second wave descends, his first instinct is to duck, to hide his face in his hands and wait for the thunder to pass. But then he looks to his left. He sees his best friend, a boy he has shared countless jokes and quiet letters with, struggling to lift a heavy, brass shell. The fear inside him does not vanish, it simply ceases to matter. He steps forward. He wraps his raw, aching hands around the warm metal of the ammunition. He does not speak. He simply locks eyes with his friend, offering a single, resolute nod. Together, they fall into a steady, methodical rhythm. Lift, pass, load. Lift, pass, load. They are exhausted, their muscles trembling with the strain, but they are anchored to the deck by an invisible, unbreakable chain of brotherhood. They are no longer fighting for a flag or a distant idea. They are fighting for the boy standing right next to them. All across the harbor, this quiet, determined heroism bloomed in the shadows. Deep within the smoking corridors of a damaged vessel, a chaplain moved through the dark. He carried no weapon. He wore no armor. His only shield was the deep, abiding love he held for the men in his care. When the heavy concussions of the second wave began to rock the ship once more, throwing men against the bulkheads, he did not seek shelter. He found a young mechanic pinned beneath a fallen piece of grating, the boy's eyes wide with a terror he could no longer hide. The chaplain knelt beside him in the rising water. As the roar of the engines washed over them, the older man leaned his body completely over the boy, shielding him from the falling debris and the showering sparks. He pressed his face close to the young man's ear, his voice a steady, soothing anchor in the violent storm. He did not speak of the battle. He recited a gentle, ancient song, his voice rising softly above the noise of the breaking steel. He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. The young mechanic closed his eyes, his frantic breathing slowly easing, finding a profound and perfect peace in the protective embrace of a man who was willing to give everything to keep him safe. Up in the lush, green hills overlooking the water, the civilian families who had hidden in their hallways heard the terrible echoes return. A mother, sitting in the dim light of her boarded-up living room, pulled her children closer to her chest. She rested her chin on her daughter's soft hair, rocking her gently back and forth. She felt a heavy, sorrowful tear slip down her cheek, completely unseen in the dark. It was a tear for the boys down in the water, boys she had never met, but whom she loved with a sudden, fierce maternal ache. She closed her eyes and sent a quiet, desperate wish out into the universe, wrapping the entire harbor in a silent prayer of protection. Her children did not cry. They simply held on to her, drawing their strength from her steady heartbeat, learning in that dark room that love is the only true shelter when the world falls apart. Down on the airfields, the smoke was so thick it blotted out the sun, turning the morning into a strange, twilight gray. The young mechanics and pilots, who had already given so much to save their beautiful silver planes, watched as the second wave swept over the tarmac. A boy whose face was stained with tears and soot stood near a cracked concrete wall. He had a small, folded letter from his sweetheart tucked safely in his pocket, resting against his chest. As the fresh rain of iron began to fall, he pressed his hand flat against his pocket, feeling the crinkled paper through the damp fabric. It was his talisman. It was his reminder of the beautiful, gentle world that still existed somewhere beyond this smoke. He did not run away. He turned back toward the burning fields, his shoulders set with a quiet, heavy determination. He joined a line of men who were passing heavy buckets of water from a broken pipe, their arms aching, their lungs burning, refusing to surrender to the fire. They were ordinary boys, caught in an extraordinary storm, choosing again and again to stand in the light of their own courage. The second wave of sorrow was a heavy, relentless burden. It tested the very limits of human endurance, pressing down on the defenders until it seemed their hearts would simply break from the weight of it all. But they did not break. They bent, they wept, they bled, but they held the line with a quiet, poetic grace that defies all understanding. When you think of these moments, do not dwell on the terror of the falling shadows. Dwell on the hands that lifted the heavy brass. Dwell on the chaplain shielding the boy in the dark. dwell on the mother rocking her children, and the boy holding the letter over his heart. These are the true stories of that morning. They are stories of a love so deep and a brotherhood so profound that it outshone the fires of the harbor. Eventually, the dark planes turned away, their heavy silhouettes shrinking into the distance, disappearing back into the northern clouds from which they had come. The roaring of the engines faded, leaving the island to the sorrowful, crackling whispers of the flames. The second wave had ended. The sky was finally, truly empty. But the boys who stood up from the decks, who wiped the fresh ash from their eyes and looked out across the ruined bay, were no longer the same boys who had gone to sleep the night before. They had walked through the deepest valley of shadows not once, but twice. They had faced the absolute end of their world, and they had found that even in the darkest, most terrifying moments, they were capable of carrying one another through. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the smoking twilight of the afternoon. They were exhausted beyond measure. They were grieving for the empty spaces beside them. But as they leaned on one another, surrounded by the heavy, silent waters of the Pacific, they stood tall. They were bound together forever by the beautiful, grim resilience they had found in the fire, ready to face whatever the changed world would ask of them next. There is a heavy, sacred silence that falls only when the sky has finally emptied itself of thunder. When the last of the dark wings vanished into the high, gray clouds, they took the terrifying roar of the morning with them, leaving behind a world that felt entirely suspended in time. The harbor, which just hours before had been a bustling, sunlit paradise of crisp white uniforms and gleaming brass, was now wrapped in a thick, numbing hush. It was the middle of the afternoon, a time that was usually reserved for lazy Sunday naps in the warm Hawaiian sand, or for sitting quietly on a sun-drenched deck with a fountain pen and a piece of delicate stationery. But the bright, cheerful sun was nowhere to be seen. It was hidden behind a massive, rolling canopy of bruised, charcoal smoke that stretched endlessly across the heavens, casting a strange, ethereal twilight over the island. The air was still, heavy with the scent of burning oil and scorched earth. But the most overwhelming thing of all was the quiet. After hours of a deafening, earth-shaking storm, the sudden absence of noise was a physical weight. The men who had fought so bravely, who had pushed their bodies far past the limits of human endurance, suddenly found themselves standing in a dreamlike void. Their ears were ringing with a high, distant frequency, a phantom memory of the falling shadows. They moved slowly, their limbs heavy and entirely devoid of the frantic energy that had kept them alive. All along the edges of the water, on the cracked concrete of the piers and the trampled green grass of the shorelines, young men simply collapsed. The adrenaline that had fueled their quiet heroism slowly drained away, leaving them hollow, fragile, and profoundly exhausted. Picture a young sailor sitting on the edge of a sea wall, his legs dangling over the dark, oil-slicked water. His uniform, once as white as a summer cloud, is completely black, soaked through with the heavy lifeblood of the broken ships. He does not try to wipe the soot from his face. He simply sits there, his shoulders slumped, staring out at the gentle, lapping waves. His hands, which had gripped heavy ropes and pulled brothers from the burning sea just a little while ago, now rest limply in his lap. They are trembling, a soft, involuntary vibration that he cannot stop. He closes his eyes and lets his head fall back against the wooden piling. He is too tired to weep. He is too tired to be afraid anymore. He is simply breathing, drawing the warm, smoky air into his lungs, feeling the slow, steady beat of his own heart. It is a quiet, beautiful miracle that he is still sitting there, and in this heavy afternoon silence, that simple truth washes over him like a gentle, settling wave. As the surreal afternoon stretched on, the numbing quiet was broken only by the softest, most heartbreaking sounds. Through the thick haze of the smoke, ghostly silhouettes began to wander. They were boys looking for their friends. They walked with a slow, shuffling gait, their heavy boots dragging against the ash-covered ground. They did not shout. Shouting felt entirely wrong in this vast, morning sanctuary. Instead, they called out in hushed, cracked whispers, their voices trembling with a desperate, tender hope. "Have you seen him?" a boy would softly ask a stranger, describing the color of his best friend's hair, or the shape of his smile, or the small silver cross he always wore around his neck. "Is he here?" another would murmur, gently turning over a piece of canvas, looking for the brother he had promised his mother he would protect. They moved through the makeshift aid stations set up on the lawns, their eyes scanning the rows of cots. When a boy finally found the face he was looking for, the reunion was entirely devoid of grand, theatrical gestures. There was no cheering. There was only a profound, silent collapsing into one another. Two young men, who had grown up on the same dusty street in a small Midwestern town, found each other near a shattered palm tree. One had a bandage wrapped tightly around his forehead, the other was covered from head to toe in dark ash. When their eyes met through the gray fog, they simply fell to their knees in the soft dirt. They wrapped their arms around one another, burying their faces in each other's shoulders. They held on with a fierce, quiet desperation, their bodies shaking with the silent sobs they had been holding back all morning. They did not need to speak. The warmth of the embrace, the undeniable, physical proof that they had both survived the fire, was everything they needed in the world. In this landscape of profound loss, the smallest, most delicate acts of kindness bloomed like tiny, beautiful flowers pushing up through the cracked earth. A civilian woman, who had walked down from the hills carrying a basket of clean towels from her own linen closet, knelt beside a young soldier resting in the grass. He was shivering, staring blankly at the dark sky, lost in the terrifying memories of the dawn. She did not ask him what he had seen. She simply reached into her basket, pulled out a soft, damp cloth, and began to gently wash his hands. She moved her fingers with infinite care, wiping away the dark oil and the gray ash, revealing the pale, young skin beneath. She hummed a low, soothing melody, a nameless tune that carried the rhythm of a rocking chair on a quiet porch. As she cleaned his hands, the boy's shivering slowly ceased. He looked at her, his eyes softening, recognizing the universal, motherly love in her gentle touch. She offered him a small, reassuring smile, a quiet promise that the world still held goodness, even on its darkest day. Everywhere you looked in that smoky twilight, you could see the unbreakable threads of human connection holding the broken pieces together. Men shared the last, precious drops of water from dented metal canteens, carefully wiping the rim before passing it to a stranger. They offered the coats off their own backs to boys who had lost theirs to the sea. They sat back to back on the warm ground, offering their bodies as a soft place to rest, leaning their tired heads together in a silent communion of survival. Amidst the wreckage that had washed up on the shoreline, the beautiful, fragile remnants of the peaceful lives they had known just yesterday were scattered like fallen leaves. A young mechanic, walking aimlessly along the edge of the water, saw a small, rectangular shape fluttering in the gentle breeze, caught against a piece of driftwood. He bent down and carefully picked it up. It was a photograph, its edges slightly scorched by the fire, but the image was entirely clear. It was a picture of a young woman standing in front of a white picket fence, wearing a summer dress and smiling radiantly at the camera. On the back, written in elegant, looping cursive, were the words, "Waiting for you." The mechanic did not know who the photograph belonged to. He did not know if the boy who had carried it in his pocket was resting on the grass nearby, or sleeping quietly beneath the dark waves of the harbor. But he knew the immense, immeasurable value of that small piece of paper. He knew that it was a tether to a beautiful world, a symbol of the love that had brought them all here. He took his own handkerchief from his pocket, gently wrapped the photograph to protect it from the ash, and carefully tucked it into the breast pocket of his shirt, right over his heart. He carried it with a sacred, quiet reverence, a guardian of someone else's most precious memory. As the long, surreal afternoon began to bleed into the early evening, the thick canopy of smoke above the island began to shift. The sun, sinking low toward the western horizon, finally found a small, narrow gap in the dark clouds. For just a few fleeting minutes, a beam of pure, golden light pierced through the gray haze, falling softly onto the scorched earth of the harbor. It was a deeply beautiful, breathtaking sight. It touched the broken silhouettes of the ships, turning the dark water into a shimmering pool of liquid copper. It fell across the faces of the exhausted, soot-stained boys resting on the grass, bathing them in a warm, heavenly glow. It was a gentle, celestial kiss upon the forehead of a grieving island. It was a quiet reminder from the universe that the sun had not been permanently extinguished, that the light would always, eventually, find a way to break through the dark. The men turned their tired faces toward that warm, golden beam, closing their eyes and letting the gentle heat wash over their skin. For a moment, the heavy burden of the day was lifted. They were just boys again, feeling the sweet Hawaiian sun on a Sunday afternoon. But the light was brief. As the sun dipped beneath the edge of the world, the shadows returned, stretching long and deep across the valleys and the bay. The true darkness of the night was coming, bringing with it a new, unknown set of fears and a profound, chilling quiet. Yet, as the survivors prepared to face the long, starless night ahead, they were not the same men who had woken up in paradise that morning. The fire had burned away the innocence of their youth, but it had forged something incredibly beautiful in its place. They had learned the true weight of brotherhood. They had discovered a quiet, towering resilience within themselves that could never be broken by falling iron or dark water. As they lay down on the scorched earth, pulling their thin blankets up to their chins, they did not feel entirely alone. They listened to the gentle, rhythmic breathing of the friends sleeping beside them. They felt the soft, cooling evening breeze rustle the leaves of the surviving palm trees. They held onto the memory of the golden light, the soft touch of a nurse's hand, and the silent, desperate embrace of a brother found in the ash. Listen to the quiet of that afternoon. Let the heavy, morning silence wash over you, not as a symbol of defeat, but as a beautiful, restful sanctuary. The storm is over. The earth is still. And the boys who carried the weight of the world on their shoulders are finally, peacefully, allowing themselves to close their eyes and rest. There is a specific kind of darkness that falls not just from the sky, but from the heavy, exhausted spaces of the human heart. When the sun finally slipped beneath the western horizon on that Sunday, it did not leave behind the beautiful, painted twilight that the Hawaiian Islands were known for. The brilliant purples and soft, blooming pinks of the evening sky were completely swallowed by the lingering curtain of smoke. And as the natural light faded away, a new, entirely unfamiliar shadow was pulled over the island. An absolute, unbroken blackout had been ordered. From the highest peaks of the Ko'olau Mountains to the gently curving beaches of Waikiki, every single light was extinguished. Oahu, a place that usually sparkled in the night like a beautiful, scattered handful of diamonds, simply disappeared into the void. Street lamps were turned off. The warm, welcoming porch lights that usually guided neighbors home were unscrewed. The headlights of the few cars creeping along the coastal roads were painted over with thick, black tar, leaving only a tiny slit of light to pierce the gloom. Above them, the sky offered no comfort. The heavy ash and the thick, rolling smoke from the harbor had drifted up to form a high, suffocating canopy. It blotted out the moon. It hid the gentle, guiding light of the constellations. It was, in every sense of the word, a night completely without stars. In this vast, ink-black silence, the island held its breath. The young men who had spent the daylight hours performing acts of unimaginable, quiet heroism were now faced with a different kind of trial. They were sent out into the tall, swaying grass of the coastlines, or told to stand on the darkened, oil-slicked piers. They were handed heavy rifles and told to watch the water. Picture a young sentry, a boy who had just left a quiet, snowy farm in Ohio only a few months ago. He lies on his stomach in the damp sand, staring out into an ocean that is completely invisible to him. The night air is cool, carrying the sharp, bitter scent of the fires that still smolder in the distance. He is so tired that his bones ache with a deep, throbbing rhythm, but his eyes remain wide open, staring into the dark. The darkness plays cruel, gentle tricks on an exhausted mind. The soft, rhythmic rustling of the palm fronds rubbing together in the trade winds sounds terribly like the creeping footsteps of an approaching stranger. The gentle slap of the waves against the coral reef sounds like the muffled oars of landing boats. Every shadow seems to breathe, every rustle of the dry sugar cane makes his young heart race. He grips the wooden stock of his rifle, his knuckles pale in the dark, feeling incredibly small at the very edge of the world. But then, he hears a soft, familiar sound. It is the gentle shifting of sand, just a few feet to his right. He turns his head slowly and sees the dim, faint outline of another boy lying in the grass. It is a sailor he does not know, a boy from a different ship, a different state, a different life. The sailor reaches into his pocket and slowly extends his hand through the dark. He offers a single, small piece of hard peppermint candy. The sentry takes it, his fingers brushing against the other boy's hand. The simple, incredibly ordinary sweetness of the peppermint blooms in his mouth, an anchor to the gentle world they both remember. They do not speak. They do not need to. In that pitch-black night, lying in the damp sand, they simply share the quiet, profound comfort of knowing they are not alone. Further inland, in the quiet, residential valleys of Honolulu, the civilian families were facing their own suffocating dark. The blackout curtains, heavy wool blankets, taped-up newspapers, and dark canvas sealed the wooden houses tight. Because no light could be allowed to escape, the windows had to be pulled shut. The beautiful, cooling trade winds that normally swept through the open lanais were entirely blocked. Inside, the air grew incredibly warm and still. Families sat together on their living room floors, entirely surrounded by shadows. The radio, which usually played cheerful island melodies, offered only the soft, unsettling hiss of static, interrupted occasionally by a stern, quiet voice giving instructions to stay inside and stay calm. In one of these sweltering, dark rooms, a mother sat with her back against the wall, her legs crossed. Her 2 young children were asleep, their heads resting heavy and warm in her lap. She gently stroked their damp hair, tracing the soft curves of their faces in the dark. She was terrified of the unknown, frightened of the rumors that had whispered through the neighborhoods all afternoon, rumors of invasions, of poisoned water, of more planes coming in the dark. But she did not let the fear touch her children. Beside her, her husband sat in a woven wicker chair. In the absolute quiet, the only sound in the house was the slow, steady, mechanical ticking of his silver pocket watch. Tick, 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 it was a small, persistent heartbeat in the dark. The mother listened to it, focusing her mind entirely on that tiny, orderly sound. It was a reminder that time was still moving forward. The night felt endless, an ocean of dark hours to cross, but the ticking watch was a promise that the seconds were passing, and that eventually, the sun would have to rise. She leaned her head back against the plaster wall, closed her eyes, and let the gentle rhythm of the ticking soothe her racing heart. As the deepest hours of the night arrived, the adrenaline that had kept the island moving finally, completely wore off. And it was then, in the absolute privacy of the dark, that the true, heavy weight of the morning finally settled over the young men. All across the military bases, in the surviving barracks, and on the quiet beaches, the weeping began. It was not loud. It was not a chaotic, dramatic sound. It was the soft, muffled, deeply private sorrow of boys who had held their emotions in check all day because they had work to do. But now, with the fires dying down and the world wrapped in shadows, there was nothing left to distract them from the empty spaces beside them. A young mechanic lay on his canvas cot in a darkened tent. He pulled his rough wool blanket completely over his head, creating a tiny, dark cocoon. He buried his face in the scratchy fabric and finally allowed himself to cry. He cried for the boy who had slept in the bunk next to a boy who had taught him how to play the guitar on quiet Sunday afternoons. He cried for the beautiful silver airplanes that were now just pools of melted aluminum. He cried because the world had changed so violently, and he was so very far from his mother's kitchen. In the cot next to him, another young man lay awake, staring up at the invisible ceiling. He heard the soft, muffled sobs coming from beneath the blanket. He did not turn away, and he did not offer a hollow platitude. He simply reached his arm across the narrow space between their beds. He rested his heavy, warm hand firmly on the shaking shoulder of his friend. He left his hand there for a long time. It was a silent, beautiful transmission of love. It said, *I know. I am here. It is okay to let it go, *. Slowly, the shivering beneath the blanket began to ease. The profound, gentle weight of that resting hand was a tether, pulling the grieving boy back from the edge of despair, reminding him that he was still held, still anchored to a brotherhood that the dark could not erase. In another corner of the island, a young officer sat quietly on the steps of a ruined building. He had found a small, perfectly intact pencil in the ash earlier that afternoon. He held it now between his fingers, turning it over and over. He closed his eyes and visualized a piece of clean, white paper in his mind. In the dark, completely from memory, he began to compose a letter to his wife. "My darling," he whispered in his mind, *I am safe. The night is very dark, and the world is very quiet now. I want you to know that in the middle of all this shadow, the only thing I can see is your face. I remember the way the porch light caught your hair when I left. I am holding onto that light tonight, *. He wrote the entire letter in his thoughts, carefully choosing every word, folding the imaginary paper, and tucking it safely into the pocket of his heart. It was a quiet act of defiance against the fear. By focusing on his love for her, he built a small, warm fire within his own soul, a light that the blackout could not extinguish. The night without stars was a crucible of waiting. It was a vast, heavy expanse of time where the imagination ran wild and the sorrow ran deep. The young men jumping at the rustling cane grass, the mothers sitting perfectly still in the sweltering dark, the boys weeping softly beneath their blankets. They were all simply trying to survive the quiet aftermath of history. But as they waited, they did not fracture. They leaned into one another. They shared pieces of hard candy, they offered steadying hands, and they held tightly to the memories of the people they loved. The darkness was absolute, but the human spirit proved to be luminous. The hours stretched on, long and slow. The tide went out, and the tide came back in, a gentle, eternal breathing of the earth that ignored the broken ships and the frightened centuries. The ocean simply continued its ancient dance, a soothing, continuous rhythm that whispered a promise to the island. If you had been there, standing in the velvet blackness of that night, you would have felt the profound, aching vulnerability of a world waiting for the dawn. But you also would have felt the quiet, beautiful strength of thousands of hearts beating together in the dark. Rest now, just as they tried to rest. Let the heavy, starless night fold around you like a quiet blanket. The rumors and the fears are just shadows dancing in the corners of the room. The sentries are awake. The mothers are watching over the children. The hands are resting gently on the shoulders of the grieving. The night is long, and the stars are hidden, but the dark cannot last forever. The earth is still turning, ever so slowly, moving them all, breath by breath, toward the healing light of the morning. There is a particular, heavy kind of silence that falls over a home when a cheerful song on the radio is suddenly cut short. It was Sunday afternoon across the vast, rolling expanse of the American mainland. The crisp, cold air of early winter had already settled over the quiet towns and the bustling cities. In the deep woods of New England, a soft, white snow was beginning to fall, drifting gently against the glass of the window panes, blanketing the front lawns in a pure, undisturbed layer of peace. In the wide, golden plains of the Midwest, the trees had surrendered their leaves to the season, and the iron wood stoves were burning with a warm, comforting crackle in the center of the house. Families were gathered in their living rooms, wrapped in thick, knitted blankets, resting comfortably in the easy, slow rhythm that follows a Sunday dinner. In the corner of these cozy rooms, the wooden cabinet of the family radio glowed with a soft, warm, amber light. The delicate glass vacuum tubes hummed quietly, pulling invisible waves from the air and turning them into beautiful, soaring symphonies, or the exciting, distant cheers of a football game. The radio was the heartbeat of the home, a comforting, familiar voice that kept the quiet afternoons company. And then, the music simply stopped. There was a brief, crackling hiss of static, a sudden clearing of the throat, and a serious, trembling voice stepped into the living rooms of the nation. When the news first arrived, it did not bring immediate, screaming panic. It brought a profound, bewildering confusion. Across the snowy porches and the warm, sunlit parlors of the country, mothers and fathers leaned forward in their armchairs. They tilted their heads toward the woven fabric of the radio speaker, their brows furrowing, trying to understand the words that were floating into their homes. They heard the name of a distant harbor. They heard the word attack. But for a few, suspended moments, the geography felt entirely unreal. To a mother sitting in a small, landlocked town in Kansas, the Pacific Ocean was just a vast, beautiful splash of pale blue on a paper map. It was a place of swaying palm trees and sweet pineapples, a paradise she had only seen in the glossy pages of a magazine. It did not seem possible that the dark, heavy clouds of war could have reached a place so perfectly bathed in the sun. But as the voice on the radio continued to speak, the geography of the world suddenly collapsed. The thousands of miles of deep, rolling water completely vanished, replaced by a sudden, terrifying closeness. Because for so many of these families, that distant, sunlit harbor was not just a point on a map. It was the place where their boys were sleeping. A father in a quiet, snowy neighborhood slowly stood up from his favorite armchair. He walked over to the wooden bookshelf, his hands trembling ever so slightly, and pulled down a heavy, leather-bound atlas. He brought it to the kitchen table, spreading it open beneath the warm, yellow light of the overhead lamp. His wife came to stand beside him. Together, in the quiet of their kitchen, they traced their fingers across the paper, moving slowly from the western edge of the mainland, out into the vast, empty blue, until they found the tiny speck of land in the middle of the ocean. They stared at it, their hearts beating a frantic, entirely new rhythm. That tiny dot of ink was where their son was. That was where his ship was anchored. As the afternoon faded into evening, and the evening surrendered to a long, restless night, a new, agonizing reality settled over the mainland. It was the reality of the wait. The flow of information in those days was not a rushing river, it was a slow, painfully quiet trickle. The telephone lines across the ocean were silent. The radios could only offer the same, repeated fragments of news, a looping chorus of uncertainty that offered no real comfort to a worried heart. And so, the families of the sailors and the soldiers were left to sit in the quiet of their own homes, entirely suspended in a bubble of desperate hope and profound, suffocating dread. In a small apartment in a bustling eastern city, a young woman sat on the edge of her sofa. She was newly married, her silver wedding band still catching the dim light of the street lamp shining through her window. Her husband had shipped out to the islands just a few months before, promising to write every single week. She had turned off all the lights in the apartment, save for the small, glowing dial of the radio. She sat there for hours, her knees pulled up to her chest, listening to the soft static. She was waiting to hear the name of his ship. Every time the announcer took a breath, her heart would stop entirely, bracing for the words that could shatter her world. When the news offered nothing new, she let out a long, shaky exhale, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. A neighbor, an older woman who had heard the news and understood the terrifying silence of the apartment, knocked softly on the door. She let herself in, carrying a warm cup of chamomile tea. She did not offer empty promises or false hopes. She simply sat down next to the young wife on the sofa, wrapped a warm woolen shawl around her trembling shoulders, and held her hand in the dark. It was a beautiful, quiet act of solidarity, a gentle tether keeping the young woman from drifting away into the terrifying sea of her own imagination. For the mothers of the boys out on the water, the waiting was a heavy, physical ache. In a farmhouse surrounded by fields of snow, a mother sat alone at her kitchen table. The house was perfectly, agonizingly quiet. In front of her, resting on the worn wooden surface, was a stack of letters. They were the letters her son had sent since he arrived in the paradise of the Pacific. She picked up the very top envelope. The paper was soft and slightly worn at the edges from how many times she had opened it. She slipped the letter out and unfolded it, tracing the familiar, curving loops of his handwriting with her fingertips. She did not just read the words, she felt them. She looked at the tiny smudge of blue ink in the corner, imagining the exact moment his hand had rested there. She lifted the paper to her face, closing her eyes, searching for the faint, impossible scent of the sea breeze or the sweet orchids he had written about. This piece of paper was the last tangible connection she had to her boy. It was a delicate, fragile bridge across the dark water. She read the final line of the letter over and over again, a soft, whispered prayer in the quiet kitchen, *I am doing fine, Mom. Don't worry about me. I will be home soon, *. She pressed the letter to her chest, right over her beating heart, holding onto his promise with a fierce, quiet devotion. She would sit at that table as the sun rose and set, trusting the boy she had raised, waiting for the world to tell her that he was safe. But as the days slowly marched forward, a new, terrifying figure emerged on the quiet streets of the American home front. He was not a soldier. He was usually just a teenage boy, wearing a simple uniform and a cap, pedaling a heavy bicycle with thick rubber tires. He was the messenger for the telegraph company. In the days before the storm, his arrival was a source of joy. He brought telegrams announcing the birth of a baby, a graduation, or a happy marriage. But now, his bicycle wheels crunching softly on the winter snow became the most terrifying sound in the world. He carried a leather satchel slung over his shoulder, and inside that satchel were the small, yellow envelopes. Paper heartbreaks. They were so light, practically weightless in the hand, but they carried a sorrow heavy enough to bring a house completely to its knees. Picture one of these young messengers. He is only 16 years old, his cheeks flushed pink from the cold winter wind. He turns his bicycle onto a quiet, tree-lined street. He stops in front of a small house with a white picket fence. He checks the address on the yellow envelope in his hand, his stomach tying itself into tight, painful knots. He knows what the paper says. He knows that the moment he rings that doorbell, the peaceful life inside that house will end forever. He walks up the front path, his footsteps slow and heavy. He climbs the wooden steps of the porch, hesitating for a long, agonizing moment before he finally reaches out and presses his finger to the bell. The door opens slowly. A mother stands in the doorway, wearing a floral apron, her hands dusted with white flour from baking bread. When she sees the boy in his uniform, and the yellow envelope trembling in his hand, she does not scream. The breath simply leaves her body in a long, quiet sigh. Her shoulders drop, and the gentle, hopeful light in her eyes is completely, softly extinguished. The young messenger cannot look her in the eye. He holds the envelope out, his own voice breaking as he whispers that he is so very sorry. And it is here, in the very epicenter of her deepest sorrow, that the profound, enduring grace of the human heart reveals itself. The mother does not turn away. She takes the yellow envelope, holding it gently against her apron. She sees the tears welling up in the young boy's eyes. She sees how the terrible burden of carrying this news is crushing his young shoulders. She reaches out, her hand still dusted with flour, and gently rests it on his arm. "It's all right, sweetheart," she whispers, her voice a fragile, broken melody. "I know this is hard for you. It's so cold outside. Would you like to come in for a moment and have a warm cup of tea?" Even as her own world shatters into a million pieces, her instinct is to comfort the child standing on her porch. It is a moment of pure, blinding beauty in the midst of the darkest grief. The young boy shakes his head, offering a quiet, deeply respectful nod, and slowly walks back to his bicycle, carrying the profound weight of her quiet dignity with him for the rest of his life. Across the country, thousands of these yellow envelopes were delivered. They were slipped through mail slots. They were handed over the counters of small-town post offices. They brought the terrible, undeniable truth of the harbor right to the front doors of the mainland. But for every yellow envelope that was delivered, there were thousands of homes that received nothing at all. They remained entirely trapped in the agonizing limbo of the wait. The mothers sat on their porches, wrapped in heavy coats, watching the road. The wives sat by the radios, listening to the names being slowly, painfully read into the airwaves. They existed in a space between hope and despair, a quiet purgatory woven entirely of love. As we reflect on the echoes of that day, we must remember the quiet battlefields of the living rooms. We must remember the immense, unseen courage of the women who sat by the windows, holding the faded letters, keeping the home fires burning while the world burned around them. Their quiet resilience, their shared tears over the back fences, and the gentle cups of tea they offered to one another were the true, enduring strength of the nation. Let the memory of their weight be a gentle reminder of the invisible threads that connect us all. The distance between the snowy porches of the mainland and the smoking waters of the harbor was entirely erased by the sheer, powerful force of a mother's love. Rest your head now. The radio has been turned off. The letters have been carefully folded and placed back in their wooden boxes. The snow continues to fall, soft and silent, covering the world in a peaceful, quiet blanket. The waiting is a heavy burden, but they did not carry it alone. They carried it together, hand in hand, sitting in the warm, dim light, holding on to hope until the very last shadow was chased away by the dawn. There is a quiet, profound grace that arrives in the soft morning light when a broken world finally decides to breathe again. When the sun rose on the days following the long, dark weekend, it illuminated an island that had been completely transformed. The heavy, suffocating blanket of black smoke that had hidden the heavens slowly began to thin, carried away by the gentle, returning trade winds. The sky, which had wept such terrible ash, slowly began to remember its true colors, painting the horizon in pale, bruised shades of lavender, soft peach, and finally, a clear, fragile blue. The air still carried the sharp, bitter scent of the fires, but the chaotic, terrifying roar of the unknown was gone. In its place was a vast, echoing stillness. It was the deep, sore quiet of an earth that had survived a terrible storm and was now waking up to survey the scattered branches. Along the shores of the harbor, the young men who had fought so desperately to save their brothers slowly pulled themselves up from the damp grass. Their bodies ached with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Their pristine white uniforms were forever stained with the dark oil and soot of history. But as they looked around at the broken steel and the scorched earth, they did not surrender to despair. Instead, a gentle, invisible shift occurred in the hearts of everyone on the island. The paralyzing shock of the sudden strike began to soften, melting away like morning frost, leaving behind a quiet, unified purpose. Before that Sunday, the military bases and the civilian neighborhoods had lived side by side, yet somewhat apart. They were two different worlds sharing the same beautiful paradise. But now, those invisible boundaries were entirely washed away. The island became a single, breathing family, bound together by the sudden, overwhelming need to mend what had been broken. Down from the lush, green valleys and the winding streets of Honolulu came the people of Hawaii. They did not come with weapons, and they did not march to the sound of a drum. They walked softly, carrying whatever they could find in their own homes. An older Hawaiian man, his face lined with the deep, peaceful wisdom of the islands, walked down to the edge of the harbor carrying his own wooden toolbox. He saw a group of young, exhausted sailors trying to repair a small, shattered wooden patrol boat. They were struggling, their hands raw and their tools inadequate. The older man did not ask for permission. He simply set his box down on the sand, pulled out a heavy wooden mallet and a handful of nails, and knelt beside the boys. He showed them how to splice the splintered wood, his large, calloused hands moving with a slow, deliberate grace. He worked in complete silence, but his presence was a towering comfort. The young sailors, far from their own fathers, watched him with quiet reverence, finding a deep, settling peace in the steady, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his hammer. It was the sound of rebuilding. It was the sound of a promise that they were not alone. Across the bases, small, beautiful acts of everyday heroism became the new routine. Women from the local neighborhoods arrived at the gates carrying woven baskets filled with food from their own pantries. They brought warm, sweet bread, jars of fresh water, and whatever fruit they could gather from their gardens. One woman, wearing a simple cotton dress, found a young mechanic sitting on an overturned metal crate. He was covered in dark grease, his head resting in his hands, completely overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the wreckage around him. She approached him gently, her footsteps making no sound on the pavement. She reached into her basket and pulled out a damp, clean cloth and a sweet, ripe mango. She did not offer him empty platitudes. She simply knelt beside him, took his trembling hand, and gently wiped the heavy soot from his fingers. Then, she placed the bright, colorful fruit in his palm. The boy looked up at her, his eyes welling with silent tears. In that small, quiet offering, he tasted the incredible sweetness of human kindness. It was a gentle reminder that the world still held soft, beautiful things, and that there were people who would care for him when his own strength failed. In the hospitals, the overwhelming rush of the first day settled into a quiet, dedicated marathon of healing. The local girls, who only days before had been planning dances and walking on the beach, now sat in long rows in the hospital corridors. They spent hours rolling white cotton bandages, their hands moving with a swift, rhythmic dedication. They sat shoulder to shoulder with the military nurses, sharing quiet stories, humming soft island melodies to keep the silence at bay. They were a beautiful tapestry of women, weaving their love into every single strip of cloth, creating a soft, protective armor for the wounded boys. And then, there were the letters. As the weeks slowly unfolded, the most desperate, pressing need for every young man on the island was to send a whisper across the ocean, to tell the mainland that they were still breathing. The military post offices, usually quiet places of routine, were flooded with thousands of young men. But there was no pushing, no angry shouting. The boys stood in long, quiet lines that snaked out the doors and down the sidewalks. They held whatever paper they could find. Some had delicate, official stationery, others held torn pieces of brown wrapping paper or the blank backs of old supply manifests. A young sailor sat cross-legged on the grass, using his own knee as a desk. He held a small, stubby pencil, chewing gently on the end as he searched for the right words. He did not write about the fire or the falling shadows. He knew his mother, sitting by the radio in a small town in Ohio, had already heard enough of the terror. Instead, he wrote with a profound, protective love. He wrote his letters slowly, his handwriting careful and measured. He wrote to tell his family that he was perfectly safe. He wrote that the sun was shining again, that the sky was blue, and that the people of the island were taking very good care of them. He asked his mother not to cry, promising her that he was okay, and that he was surrounded by friends. He folded the paper, pressing the crease flat with his thumb, sealing his love inside. When he handed it to the postmaster, it was added to a massive, towering mountain of envelopes. Those letters were not just pieces of paper. They were millions of invisible, golden threads, reaching out across the vast, dark waters of the Pacific, tying the broken hearts of the island to the anxious, waiting hearts of the mainland. They were paper birds, carrying the purest form of hope, flying home to chase away the dread. As the days turned into a week, the landscape of the harbor began to slowly, remarkably change. The chaotic, tangled wreckage was gently pulled apart and cleared away. The thick, dark oil that had coated the water was slowly skimmed from the surface, revealing the beautiful, emerald-green depths below once more. The men worked from sunrise to sundown. They did not complain about the aching muscles or the blistered hands. They were driven by a deep, quiet resolve that had been forged in the ashes of the attack. It was not a loud, boastful anger. It was a solemn, unbreakable promise to the brothers they had lost. Every piece of twisted metal they hauled away, every patch of canvas they sewed together, was a quiet act of remembrance. They were sweeping the floor of a sacred sanctuary, honoring the fallen by making the world right again. Even the nights, which had been so terrifying in the immediate aftermath, began to feel different. The strict blackout was still entirely in effect. When the sun went down, the island was once again plunged into an absolute, ink-black darkness. But the shadows no longer held the same paralyzing fear. The darkness became a soft, protective blanket. Families sat on their porches, completely invisible to one another, but perfectly aware of their neighbor's presence. They spoke in hushed, gentle whispers across the wooden fences. They shared the news they had heard on the radio, or simply sat in the quiet, listening to the eternal, soothing rhythm of the ocean waves breaking against the shore. On the bases, the young sentries still stood their watch in the dark, but they were no longer jumping at the rustle of the palm fronds. They stood tall, their breathing steady and calm. They looked out over the invisible water not with terror, but with a quiet, watchful strength. They knew that the island was entirely united behind them. They knew that in the houses up in the valleys, mothers were whispering prayers for their safety, and that in the tents behind them, their brothers were sleeping, trusting them to guard the door. This is the profound beauty of the human spirit. When the world is burned down to the very ground, it does not simply blow away in the wind. The ashes settle into the earth. They mix with the soil, and they become the foundation for a new, incredible kind of strength. The people of Hawaii, the young sailors, the tired nurses, and the local carpenters, they took the ashes of that Sunday morning and turned them into resolve. They did not let the darkness win. They found the light in each other. They found it in a shared cup of water, in a helping hand, in a letter written on a torn piece of paper, and in the quiet, steady rhythm of a hammer mending a broken boat. As you listen to the quiet of this night, think of that beautiful, gentle resolve. Think of the way the island slowly, steadily began to breathe again, held together by the invisible, unbreakable bonds of love and community. The storm had passed. The broken pieces were being picked up, one by one, with infinite, tender care. The world would never be exactly the same as it was before the shadows fell, but as the sun set over the Pacific, casting a warm, golden glow over the healing harbor, it was clear that the spirit of the people remained perfectly, beautifully intact. Let the soothing rhythm of their quiet work lull you into peace. Let the memory of their gentle heroism wrap around you like a warm quilt. The ashes have settled, the sky is clear, and the world is slowly, surely, learning how to mend. Rest your eyes, trust in the dawn, and know that even after the deepest sorrow, there is always a way to heal. There is a patient, beautiful magic in the way the earth slowly forgives the deepest wounds. As the heavy, smoke-filled days eventually gave way to weeks, and the weeks softly melted into the gentle turning of the seasons, the island of Oahu began a long, quiet process of breathing again. Nature, with her infinite and tender grace, stepped forward to mend the broken landscape. The warm, tropical rains fell like a soothing balm over the scorched earth, washing away the gray ash and the bitter scent of the fires. Slowly, miraculously, the vibrant green shoots of new grass began to push their way up through the blackened soil. The plumeria trees, whose delicate branches had been stripped bare by the sudden storm, gathered their quiet strength and pushed forth new, brilliantly colored blossoms. They filled the island air once again with that sweet, intoxicating perfume, a fragrant promise that life would continue. The harbor, too, underwent a beautiful, silent purification. The endless, rhythmic tides of the vast Pacific Ocean swept into the bay day after day, drawing the heavy, dark waters out to the deep sea and replacing them with a brilliant, sparkling blue. The twisted metal and the shadows of the past were slowly cleared away or allowed to settle into the soft, forgiving mud of the ocean floor. The island wrapped its warm, green arms around the scars, covering them in a blanket of moss, swaying palms, and unbroken sunlight. But while the earth healed the physical world, the human heart followed a much slower, much more delicate path. The young men who had stood shoulder to shoulder in the dark, who had pulled their brothers from the burning water and wept quietly beneath the starless sky, eventually returned to their homes. They crossed the great ocean once more, leaving the tropical paradise behind, and stepped back into the quiet rhythms of the mainland. They traded their crisp, white uniforms for the soft flannel shirts of civilian life. They became fathers. They became quiet, gentle grandfathers. They built houses with wide front porches, they planted gardens in the spring, and they sat in wooden rocking chairs watching the snow fall in the winter. On the outside, they simply grew older. Their hair turned a soft, distinguished silver, and their faces were painted with the deep, beautiful lines of a long life lived. But on the inside, in the quietest, most private chambers of their souls, a piece of them never left that Sunday morning. Picture an old man, sitting in a worn leather armchair in a quiet, sunlit living room. The house is completely still, save for the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. On his lap sits a small, wooden cedar box. His hands, now spotted with age and trembling just slightly, undo the small brass clasp. Inside the box, resting on a bed of faded velvet, is a single, yellowed envelope. It is a letter from his best friend, a boy who used to play the harmonica on the deck of their ship while the sun went down. The paper is incredibly fragile now, thin and translucent as a moth's wing. The old man does not even need to unfold it to know the words, they have been carved into his memory for a lifetime. He simply rests his fingertips against the dry paper, closing his eyes. He is no longer an old man in a quiet house. He is a boy again, feeling the warm Hawaiian breeze, listening to the cheerful, metallic notes of the harmonica drifting over the water. He does not feel anger anymore. The sharp, terrifying edges of the history have been entirely worn smooth by the long river of time. What remains is only a profound, enduring ache of love. He smiles softly, a single tear catching in the deep wrinkles beside his eye, and whispers a quiet greeting into the empty room. He gently closes the cedar box, keeping his friend safe, keeping the memory warm. As the years drifted by, many of these gentle, aging men felt a quiet, persistent pull drawing them back across the water. They returned to the island not as warriors, but as pilgrims. When they walk along the shores of the harbor today, they often lean on the arms of their grown children or hold the small, trusting hands of their grandchildren. They walk with a slow, deliberate reverence. The harbor is breathtakingly peaceful now. The water ripples gently in the trade winds, reflecting the soft white clouds passing overhead. Small, brightly colored sailboats glide across the bay, completely unaware of the heavy history resting beneath their hulls. Out in the middle of this beautiful, sparkling water floats a structure of pure, pristine white. It is the memorial, a graceful, sweeping arch that rests gently above the sunken remains of the great ship. It does not touch the rusted steel below. It simply hovers over it, like a protective, loving embrace, forming a quiet bridge between the world of the living and the world of the sleeping. When the old men step onto this white monument, they step into a sacred, hushed sanctuary. The wind blows freely through the large, open windows, carrying the clean scent of the sea salt and the soft, distant sounds of the island. They walk slowly to the far end of the memorial, where a massive wall of cool, white marble stretches up toward the ceiling. Carved into this stone are the names. Thousands of names, inscribed in perfect, orderly columns. An old man approaches the wall, letting go of his grandson's hand for just a moment. He steps close to the marble, his eyes scanning the letters until he finds the one he has been carrying in his heart for so many decades. He reaches out. His withered hand, his fingertips trembling as they trace the cold, carved grooves of his brother's name. He rests his palm flat against the stone, leaning his forehead against the marble. "I have lived a good life for us both," he whispers, his voice barely audible over the gentle rushing of the wind. "I have remembered you. I have missed you every single day." His grandson, a little boy with bright, innocent eyes, steps up beside him and gently wraps his small arms around the old man's waist. The grandfather rests his hand on the child's head, feeling the warmth of the new life leaning against him. In that beautifully quiet moment, the past and the future are completely intertwined. The sorrow of the history is softened, held in the gentle, unbroken continuum of love and family. But the most breathtaking, deeply moving reminder of the past does not come from the white marble or the carved names. It comes from the water itself. Deep beneath the sparkling surface, resting quietly in the soft, dark silt, the great steel hull of the battleship sleeps. Over the many passing decades, the ocean has claimed her. The jagged edges of the broken metal have been completely softened by the sea. She is now covered in a beautiful, vibrant coat of coral. Small, colorful fish dart through her rusted portholes, turning the quiet, underwater corridors into a living, breathing sanctuary. Nature has transformed a place of sudden sorrow into a deeply peaceful, protected reef. Yet, she has not forgotten the boys she holds inside. If you stand at the railing of the White Memorial and look down into the clear, green-blue water, you will see a gentle, incredible phenomenon. From the very heart of the rusted ship, from deep within the dark, silent compartments where the young men are still resting side by side, small drops of black oil slowly break free. They are perfectly round, dark pearls. They detach from the old steel and begin a slow, silent journey upward through the water. They rise one by one, a steady, rhythmic pulse that looks remarkably like the beating of a very quiet, very patient heart. When these drops finally reach the surface of the harbor, they blossom. They spread out across the water, catching the bright Hawaiian sunlight, transforming instantly into swirling, iridescent ribbons of brilliant pink, deep violet, and shimmering gold. The people who care for the harbor call them the Black Tears. Even now, after all the turning pages of the calendar, after all the changing seasons and the long passage of the years, the ship still weeps. It is a slow, persistent release of memory. It is as if the ship is breathing for the boys who cannot breathe for themselves, sending a continuous, gentle message up to the sky. When you stand there and watch those beautiful, colored ribbons drift across the water, you do not feel fear, and you do not feel despair. You feel a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. The tears are not a symbol of an open wound, they are a gentle, lingering perfume of a love that simply refuses to fade away. They are a quiet reminder that the boys below are still there, that their sacrifice is still incredibly present, and that the earth itself is holding their memory in a warm, eternal embrace. Visitors from all over the world stand at that railing, completely mesmerized by the rising tears. They speak in soft, reverent whispers. Some of them gently toss a single, beautiful flower into the water, a bright pink hibiscus or a delicate white orchid. The flower lands softly on the surface, drifting along with the iridescent oil, casting a tiny, beautiful shadow down toward the sleeping deck below. The rust and the remembrance have blended together perfectly. The harsh, terrifying edges of that long-ago Sunday have been smoothed over by the gentle hands of time, leaving only the soft, beautiful core of humanity that survived the fire. The island has healed. The boys who lived have loved, and laughed, and grown old. And the boys who stayed behind are resting in the most beautiful, peaceful cradle the world could possibly offer. Close your eyes, and imagine that quiet, floating white sanctuary. Listen to the soft, continuous hush of the wind moving through the open windows. Smell the sweet, clean salt of the Pacific Ocean mixing with the faint, earthly scent of the plumeria blossoms. Feel the warm, golden sun resting gently on your shoulders. The world is entirely at peace here. The great storm has passed, and it will never return to these quiet waters. The black tears rise, the flowers drift softly on the current, and the island sings a slow, beautiful lullaby of remembrance. It is a song of deep, abiding love, a quiet promise that we will hold them softly in our hearts, today, tomorrow, and for all the gentle, peaceful years to come. There is a gentle, eternal rhythm to the ocean that eventually washes away even the deepest sorrows of the world. If you were to stand on the quiet shores of the harbor today, just as the late afternoon sun begins to dip toward the horizon, you would feel a profound and absolute peace. The tide of time is a beautiful, unstoppable force. It does not erase the love, and it does not erase the memory, but it slowly, carefully smooths over the sharp and jagged edges of history. The air here no longer carries the heavy, bitter scent of smoke or the frantic echoes of a broken morning. Instead, the gentle trade winds bring only the soft, sweet perfume of blooming ginger, the fresh, clean salt of the Pacific, and the quiet, rustling whispers of the palm fronds swaying against a clear, painted sky. The water of the bay, which once churned with terror and shadow, has returned to its truest, most innocent form. It is a vast, sparkling mirror of emerald and sapphire, rising and falling with the slow, deep breathing of the earth. The ocean is incredibly wise, and it is endlessly patient. Over the long, quiet turning of the years, the sea has taken the broken remnants of that day and completely transformed them. It has wrapped the rusted steel in a beautiful, vibrant blanket of coral, turning a place of overwhelming loss into a quiet, living sanctuary. Down in the cool, silent depths, the boys who never left the harbor are not trapped in the terror of the past. They are completely, perfectly safe. They are insulated from the noise and the rush of the modern world above. The heavy iron of their ships is no longer a cage, it is a cradle, rocked gently and eternally by the shifting currents. They are resting side by side with the boys they loved the most, their brothers and their best friends, caught in a beautiful, permanent Sunday morning. The water sings a continuous, soft lullaby to them, a melody composed of drifting tides and the gentle movement of brightly colored fish slipping through the shadows. Up above, on the surface of the world, life is beautifully and stubbornly carried on. The generations that followed the storm did not grow up in the shadows of despair. They grew up in the warm, golden light of the peace that those young men secured. Picture a quiet, sunlit room in a home far away from the islands. The house is completely still, filled with the gentle, floating dust motes of a lazy afternoon. A woman, whose hair is just beginning to turn a soft silver, sits on the floor beside an old, wooden chest. She opens the heavy lid, the brass hinges softly creaking in the quiet room. Inside, tucked beneath the folds of a soft, wool blanket, she finds a small bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. They are the letters her father wrote when he was just a young sailor, anchored in a beautiful paradise long before the sky fell. She carefully unties the ribbon, sliding the delicate, translucent paper from the envelope. She reads his words, tracing the loops of his handwriting with her fingertips. He does not write about the dark things. He writes about the impossible blue of the water, the taste of fresh pineapple, and how much he misses the sound of the rain on their farmhouse roof. He writes with the pure, untroubled innocence of youth. As she reads, she does not feel the heavy weight of tragedy. She feels a profound, radiant warmth. She feels the deep, unbroken line of love that stretches from that young boy on a ship, straight through the decades, right into her own beating heart. She folds the letter carefully, pressing it to her chest, and smiles. Her father survived the fire. He came home, he built a life, he taught her how to ride a bicycle, and he walked her down the aisle. He carried the quiet, heavy memories of his fallen brothers with him every single day, but he did not let the darkness extinguish his gentle spirit. He lived a life overflowing with love, honoring the boys who could not by simply appreciating the beauty of every single sunrise. This is the true legacy of the harbor. It is not found in the textbooks, and it is not found in the cold, unyielding metal of the monuments. It is found in the quiet, everyday moments of peace that we are all allowed to breathe. It is found in the laughter of children chasing each other across the warm, golden sands of Waikiki, entirely unaware of the history resting just a few miles away. It is found in the soft, glowing porch lights of a quiet neighborhood, left on to guide a loved one home. It is found in the simple, breathtaking freedom of closing your eyes at night and knowing that the sky above you is perfectly safe. For the young men who survived that day, the long, slow tide of time eventually carried them to the end of their own beautiful journeys. As they grew old, and their steps became slow and tired, they did not look back on their lives with bitterness. In their final, quiet days, as they rested in soft beds surrounded by the families they had built, many of them spoke of a strange and beautiful comfort. When they closed their eyes for the last time, they did not see the smoke or the falling shadows. They saw the bright, sunlit decks of their youth. They saw the vast, sparkling Pacific stretching out before them. And they saw their friends, the boys who had remained forever young, forever 19 and 20 years old, standing by the railing, smiling, and holding out their hands. There is a profound, comforting beauty in the thought that they are all together again. The great, invisible wounds of the world have finally been completely healed. The separation is over. They are reunited on a quiet, misty shore, where the air is perfectly sweet, where the ships never sink, and where the sun never sets on their brotherhood. As evening approaches the island today, the transformation from the past to the present is beautifully complete. The sun dips below the western mountains, painting the sky in a breathtaking watercolor of deep lavender, rich indigo, and soft, blooming peach. The shadows that stretch across the water are no longer things of terror, they are simply the gentle, familiar precursors to sleep. And then, the most beautiful miracle of all occurs. The stars return. Decades ago, on a night filled with fear and suffocating smoke, the island was forced into a terrible, pitch-black silence. The people hid in their homes, terrified of the sky, unable to see a single point of light in the overwhelming dark. But tonight, the sky is clear, and the blackout is forever lifted. As the twilight deepens, the stars begin to emerge, one by one, like tiny, glowing diamonds scattered across a vast canopy of soft velvet. They shine with a brilliant, steady light, entirely undisturbed by the troubles of the earth below. The Milky Way stretches across the heavens, a beautiful, swirling river of starlight that watches over the harbor like a gentle, eternal guardian. Down in the valleys of Honolulu, the windows of the houses are warmly illuminated. You can see the soft, golden squares of light shining through the trees. Inside, families are sitting down to dinner, sharing stories of their day, completely safe, completely free. The island sparkles once more, a brilliant, glowing jewel resting in the center of the dark ocean. The world was forever changed on that long-ago Sunday, but it did not stop turning. The human spirit, with its incredible capacity for resilience, for forgiveness, and for profound, enduring love, simply rebuilt the paradise. They took the ashes and turned them into gardens. They took the sorrow and turned it into a quiet, towering monument to peace. Now, the harbor is incredibly still. The white memorial floats gracefully over the water, glowing faintly in the starlight. The black tears still rise from the depths, but in the quiet of the night, they simply dissolve into the gentle, rhythmic lapping of the waves against the shore. It is time to let the history rest. The boys in the harbor are sleeping a deep, beautiful sleep. The centuries have all gone home. The mothers no longer have to wait by the windows, and the terrible, falling shadows have been entirely chased away by the gentle passage of time. Close your eyes, and take a long, slow breath. Draw in the cool, sweet night air. Feel the absolute stillness of the world around you. Listen to the very faint, rhythmic sound of the ocean moving in the dark. It is the steady heartbeat of the earth, a sound that has existed since the beginning of time, and will continue long after we are gone. It is whispering a soft, ancient lullaby. Hush now, the water says. Asterisk, the storm is long gone. The night is beautiful. The stars are shining just for you, asterisk. Let the heavy weight of the day slip completely from your shoulders. Let the soft, warm blanket of the dark fold around you, protecting you, keeping you perfectly safe. There is nothing left to worry about. There is nothing left to fear. The world has healed, the peace has been won, and the deep, loving tide of time has washed every last tear away. Sleep now. Let the gentle rhythm of the water carry you into your dreams. The harbor is at peace. The island is at peace. And you, held softly in the quiet embrace of the night, are entirely, perfectly at peace.